He was 14 years old when Lord Eddard Stark brought him north, his life as a ward sealed by the fortunes of war and the demands of peace. In the early days, Theon Greyjoy felt the chill of Winterfell in his bones, but over time, that chill became as familiar to him as the salt winds of the Iron Islands. He joked and laughed with Robb and Jon in the courtyard, trained under Ser Roderick's watchful eye with the other squires, and spent long evenings by the hearth in the great hall, where the smell of roast pork and burning logs felt more comforting than the cold stone walls ever could. If there was any bitterness in his heart about being a hostage, it waned over the years, replaced by a grudging acceptance that this was life now. He was a Greyjoy by birth, but the world treated him more as a son of Eddard Stark than the boy who had once bounced on Balon Greyjoy's knee. When the news came from King's Landing that Ned Stark was executed, it felt as if a fierce winter gale had swept through Winterfell. Even Theon's heart ached at the thought of the man who had, in many ways, been the truest father he'd ever known. He had still hoped, in a childish way, that Ned Stark might survive his captivity, that there would be some last-minute clemency. But mercy was a rare virtue at court, so Theon looked on when Robb Stark was proclaimed king in the north. He thought about the Iron Crown of the Iron Islands sometimes, the one his father had claimed, but he knew no such crown would be offered to him. Instead, he stood behind Robb in the solemn hush of the great hall, joining the other northern lords in the fierce cry of "The King in the North." The words reverberated in his bones, made his blood run hot, and for a moment, he felt less like a captive and more like a brother standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who would be king. And yet the question always hovered. What place did Theon Greyjoy truly have in this new war? His father sat upon Pike, rumored to be plotting all manner of rebellions. When the ravens went out calling northern banners to march south, Theon had a choice. In the original Strand of Fate, he left for the Iron Islands, seeking his father's allegiance for Robb and dreaming perhaps of returning in glory to the place he had once called home. But in another telling, in another turning of the great wheel of time, Theon Greyjoy never left Winterfell. Instead, he stayed by Robb's side, the shadow of the direwolf cast long over the north, and the shape of things to come changed forever. It began in the great hall one night shortly after Ned's passing. The hush was deep. Robb Stark was speaking to his bannermen, deciding how they would march, how they would fight the Southrons who followed the hated boy King Joffrey. Theon sat on the long bench, eyes fixed upon the man he called friend. At this time, Robb was just older than Theon by a year, but it felt like more. The weight of leadership, of a war not sought but thrust upon him, had carved lines of responsibility into Robb's young face. Lady Catelyn's presence, too, was formidable. Her grief at her husband's death made her manner stern as iron. They spoke of forging alliances, of the need to build a navy or secure the seas somehow. It was then that Theon found himself staring at the table, the flicker of torchlight dancing over a map of Westeros. His own longing to return to Pike tugged at his heart, but something else kept him anchored. He looked at Bran, who sat quietly in a wheeled chair at the edge of the hall, and at Rickon, a boy of 6 whose innocence was unknowing and precarious. Winterfell was in tumult and needed steady hands. Theon's chance to leave came in the form of a conversation with Lady Catelyn in a corridor dimly lit by torches. She had come to him, hesitant but resolved. "You are your father's last surviving son," she said gravely. "There may come a time when the Iron Islands' support would be valuable to Robb. That may be the only chance to keep the Lannisters off our shores." She paused. "We have known you many years, Theon. You have proved yourself loyal, but there are ties of blood that cannot be ignored. If you wish it, you could go to Pike and bring your father's fleet to Robb's cause. You would be well rewarded." Theon heard his own breath echo in the vaulted hallway. The stones were older than memory, walls that had witnessed triumphs and betrayals. For a moment, he envisioned riding to the stony beaches of his childhood, forging a bond between Balon Greyjoy and Robb Stark. But he also saw how precarious such a mission would be. Balon was a proud man, twice as stubborn as the rest of the realm combined, and the contempt in his father's eyes had always burned Theon more than any physical blow. Theon knew in his marrow that Balon would only see him as a living reminder of the failed rebellion, a hostage turned half-northerner, a boy who had grown more comfortable with wolves than with krakens. It felt like an invitation to be scorned and used. He wondered if he could stomach that. Yet Theon was rash by nature, eager for glory. The promise of winning a name for himself, no longer just a hostage at Winterfell but the man who brought Pike's ships to the king in the north, was tempting. But that night, alone with his thoughts in his chilly bedchamber, he turned the idea over and over like a coin minted on both faces. If he left, would he return as a traitor or a hero? If Balon refused him, would Theon then be forced to betray Robb in a bid to salvage something, anything of his own birthright? The risk was enormous, and for the first time in his life, Theon understood that the bond he shared with the Starks was not merely duty but a form of love, a deep familial affection that had grown in the shadows. He did not want to see it cast aside by the tide of his father's ambitions. He did not want to sacrifice all he had found here in the north: respect, belonging, brotherhood, even if it was a brotherhood with complicated edges. So he came to Robb Stark in the Godswood, where the old weirwood stood silent witness in the moonlight. Robb had come to pray, or at least to reflect, the way his father used to do. Gray wind padded quietly among the roots. Theon cleared his throat, and Robb turned. A slight frown of worry etched on his brow. They were alone except for the giant direwolf, who eyed Theon with a low, rumbling acceptance. "I spoke with your lady mother," Theon began, stepping carefully across mossy ground. "She says I should sail to Pike and try to gain my father's support. She thinks I can talk him into fighting for the North." Robb's face was unreadable in the silver wash of moonlight. "I know," he said softly, "but I didn't want to ask you. I thought you should decide on your own." Theon felt a twinge of gratitude. In so many ways, Robb Stark was everything a lord ought to be: honorable, concerned for his people. "I've decided," Theon said, and he hesitated only a second before the words left his mouth. "I'm not going. You need me more here, I think. You need an ally you can trust, not some uncertain envoy in a place where I might be forced to betray you. I'd like to stay if you'll have me." Theon tried to hide the flicker of vulnerability in his face. He did not wish to appear weak, but he wanted Robb to know that his loyalty was no small thing. Robb's lips curved in a faint smile, one that did not entirely reach his sorrowful eyes. "I'd have you stay," he said. "We'll find another way to secure the seas." That moment sealed Theon's fate upon the northern path. He remained in Winterfell when the host of the North assembled, and he rode beside Robb Stark when they marched south. His presence caused some murmurs among the bannermen. Roose Bolton, in particular, was not fond of keeping an Ironborn so close to the new king in the north, but Theon's skill with a bow and his willingness to fight for Robb's cause quieted most tongues. He was part of Robb's inner circle, a friend the young lord trusted more than most, and as the columns of men stretched out along the King's Road, Theon rode with them, adrenaline and uncertainty warring in his gut. When the war began in earnest, he found that his skill in archery and his reckless courage were prized commodities. In one of the earliest skirmishes, near the Twins, Theon proved his worth. Riding out with Robb's outriders, he spotted a Lannister foraging party attempting to cut off a supply train. Theon led a swift attack, arrows flying true, scattering the enemy before they could strike. It was a small victory, but one that earned him nods of approval from the veterans among Robb's forces. Soon enough, the rumors that the Kraken fights with the wolf spread through the camps, turning Theon into something of a curiosity. Men wondered if the Greyjoy would betray them as soon as he saw an opening. But as the weeks rolled into months, no betrayal came. Though Theon stayed loyal, there were still days when doubt gnawed at him like a rat in the dark. He knew that at some point, he would face his father's wrath or be forced to come to terms with the Iron Islands. But each time the question rose, he reminded himself that life had not been kind to him on Pike, that his father had not come for him or even once sought his return in earnest. To Balon, Theon was a hostage sent to ensure submission, nothing more. Theon thought that perhaps, in the eyes of the old men on the Iron Islands, he was a cautionary tale, not a beloved son. It hurt him to admit that, but it hardened his resolve to stand with the Starks, who had given him everything that his own blood family never had. The War of the Five Kings burned hot, like a raging fire that devoured the countryside. Robb's victories in the field became the stuff of legend. They called him the Young Wolf, unstoppable in battle, and men spoke of him warging with his dire wolf, moving as one lethal creature. Theon Greyjoy was no general, but he took pride in riding at Robb's flank, loosing arrows into the confusion of battle, ensuring that his friend was never exposed without someone guarding his side. In one such clash near the Whispering Wood, Theon proved crucial in capturing Jaime Lannister. The Kingslayer nearly broke free from the encircling northern lines, but Theon took a reckless shot that spooked Jaime's horse and allowed Robb's men to close in. He recounted the story to the men around the campfire for months afterward, reveling in the cheers of the soldiers who once might have spat at the sight of an Ironborn in their midst. They marched onward, forging alliances. Lady Catelyn negotiated with the Freys, securing passage. The cost was a marriage promise, binding Robb to one of Walder Frey's daughters. Theon saw the flicker of distaste in Robb's expression whenever it was brought up, but war demanded sacrifices. Everyone sacrificed something. Theon understood that well enough. When winter threatened, Robb made the decision to send some forces back north. There was no sense weakening their hold on Winterfell by sending every fighting man away. Ser Roderick Castle was tasked with guarding Bran and Rickon. One day, as the snow began to dust the ground, Theon approached Robb near the supply wagons. The king in the north was weary but resolute. There was gray in the sky, a promise of storms to come. "You should stay with them," Robb said quietly. "If something happens here, or if I can't hold the south, the north must endure. You could be of great help defending Winterfell." Theon remembered how, in another world, he would have returned to the Iron Islands. Instead, he stood before Robb, a swirl of cold air rustling his dark cloak. "I'm your man," he answered simply. "I want to be where you need me most." Robb's gaze flickered. "I need you here," he admitted, "but I need loyal men in Winterfell too." Then his voice softened. "Tell me true, Theon. Would you rather remain behind the walls of Winterfell, or ride beside me in the thick of battle?" Theon grinned, though his face was tired. "You know the answer." Robb returned the faintest shadow of a smile. I do. Pack your gear, then. We ride for Riverrun on the morrow." And so Theon did not remain safely in the north. Instead, he followed the king in the north's campaign through the Riverlands, forging friendships with men like the Great John, Roose Bolton's Silent Men, and the Blackfish Brynden Tully, who was as sharp-tongued as any man Theon had ever met. They sieged Harrenhal, that looming ruin, where the nights were haunted by old curses. They skirted the edges of the Lannister strongholds. Wherever they went, they found the realm in chaos, as Stannis Baratheon and Renly Baratheon each declared themselves king, dividing the south. From time to time, a raven arrived bearing tidings from Pike, of Balon's rages, of Ironborn longships harrying the western coasts, of the old way stirring again. Theon felt a pang of dread, wondering if eventually he would be forced to face his own people as enemies on the battlefield. But for the moment, Pike was far away, cut off by land, with no straightforward path for the Ironborn to threaten the Riverlands. Theon was free to continue as he was, a bow at Robb's side, a shield for the king in the north. In the midst of this bloody campaign, Theon found fellowship among the other young lords. Edmure Tully would sometimes look at Theon askance, uncertain how to regard a Greyjoy, but the respect Theon had earned in battle chipped away at Edmure's doubts. Theon also developed a rapport with the Blackfish, who admired skill and courage no matter its source. On many days, as they patrolled the fords, Theon would jest with the Blackfish, calling him Uncle Brynden, drawing an exasperated but tolerant shake of the head from the older knight. Theon liked that sense of camaraderie. It eased the gnawing longing in his chest and the constant tension that he might be judged for the sins of his family. As the year wore on, the war continued to escalate. Stannis defeated his brother Renly under mysterious circumstances, and rumors swirled of shadow magic and dark plots. Theon paid little heed to such rumors, but others whispered in the camps about the Red Woman at Stannis' side. The Lannisters grew in power, forging alliances with the Tyrells after Renly's death. Robb, for his part, pressed an advantage in the west, scoring victories that made the bards sing. Theon stood at the center of many of these battles, loosing arrow after arrow into Lannister ranks, cutting down outriders, and chasing frightened conscripts who fled before the North's fierce onslaught. Then came the moment of heartbreak. Theon remembered it vividly, a warm day near the crag, where Robb's host had paused to rest. Word reached them that Winterfell had been attacked. Not by Lannisters, not by any southern lord, but by the Ironborn. Balon Greyjoy had launched his invasion of the North, sailing a fleet around to the stony shore, capturing Deepwood Motte, and sending a raiding party toward Winterfell itself. Robb's face went white with dread, and Theon felt his stomach twist in horror. His father's people had broken the peace in the north, and there was no one there to protect Bran and Rickon except a small garrison led by Ser Roderick. The ravens told of chaos, of some Ironborn chieftain named Dagmar Cleftjaw, of new demands that the North lay down arms. Lady Catelyn's face was ashen when she learned that her younger sons were in grave danger. Theon's first instinct was to ride north in a fury, but the North was far, and they had a war on two fronts now. Lady Catelyn's voice trembled as she demanded that Robb send help to Winterfell. But Robb had no men to spare without abandoning the Riverlands, leaving it open to the Lannisters. Theon pleaded with Robb for a small contingent, at least enough to slip around the neck and reach Winterfell undetected. The Great John, furious that the Ironborn had broken the king in the North's territory, volunteered a few hundred men. Roose Bolton said it would be folly to split their forces further. The argument raged. In the end, Robb listened to Theon's pleas. A detachment was formed, a swift-moving group of cavalry and outriders who would hurry north, hopefully before the Ironborn could fully fortify Winterfell. Theon insisted on leading it so that he might prove that he stood with the North, not with Balon Greyjoy. Robb clasped his friend's shoulder, his voice quiet. "If my brothers come to harm, we will never forget," he murmured, and in his eyes, Theon saw a pain that cut to the core. The words stung Theon more than any blow. "Save them," Robb said simply, and that was that. They rode hard under cover of night and day with barely any rest. The men with Theon were loyal Northerners, men who had bled for Robb, and some looked askance at their Ironborn captain. But no one could deny the determination that blazed in Theon's eyes. He led them through byways he remembered from old hunts, crossing near Moat Cailin, which the Ironborn supposedly held, but taking hidden paths. Now, more than ever, Theon's knowledge of the North proved valuable. He might not have grown up in these lands as a Stark, but he had hunted with Robb, explored with Bran and Jon, learned from the Master of Horse and the Kennel Master all the smaller trails. He used every ounce of that knowledge to evade the Ironborn patrols. When at last they neared Winterfell, they saw black smoke curling into the sky. Theon's heart pounded, and he urged his horse faster, the wind whipping his cloak behind him. Cresting a small rise, he beheld Winterfell's walls scorched, parts of the castle blackened by fire, though the stronghold itself still stood. The gates were manned by Ironborn warriors who barked at each other in coarse pike dialect. Theon knew their kind. They were raiders, men who thrived on pillage. A savage anger flared in Theon's chest. He raised a hand, and the outriders behind him readied themselves. They attacked at dawn, using the element of surprise. Theon put an arrow through the throat of the first Ironborn who dared raise a war horn. The Northmen crashed against the gate, battering it down with a hastily assembled ram. Smoke stung their eyes, and the screams of steel on steel echoed through the courtyard. Theon vaulted off his horse, dropping 2 Ironborn with swift shots, then drew his sword and charged into the fray. He locked eyes with Dagmar Cleftjaw, a grizzled raider with a deep scar across his face. Dagmar snarled, "Little Theon, finally come home. Thought you'd be bringing your father's blessings, not a pack of wolves." "I'm no friend of yours," Theon spat, and he lashed out, sword meeting Dagmar's axe in a shower of sparks. The battle for Winterfell was grim. The Ironborn had not expected such a swift counterattack, and though they fought ferociously, Theon's contingent outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1. They pressed the raiders back, yard by yard, into the very great hall where so many feasts had been held. Dagmar cursed Theon, calling him a traitor to his own blood. But Theon's only answer was the ring of steel. When he finally disarmed Dagmar, the older man sneered. "Spill my blood, then. My ghost will haunt you, bastard." Theon, face contorted in fury, drove his sword through Dagmar's chest, ending the raider's life with a shuddering gasp. As the Ironborn either surrendered or were cut down, Theon had but one urgent question. "Where are Bran and Rickon?" He tore off his helmet, ignoring the gash on his cheek. A trembling northern boy they had rescued from the dungeons pointed him toward the crypts. Theon led a handful of men there, moving with torchlight through the damp darkness. The Stone Kings of Winterfell sat in silent vigil, their shadows shifting on the walls as Theon's torch bobbed. He found the two young Starks huddled in an alcove, guarded by Hodder, the gentle giant. Bran was pale, eyes wide with fear, while Rickon clung to his older brother's arm. At the sight of Theon and the familiar cloak with the direwolf sigil, Rickon let out a wail and ran to cling to Theon's legs. Theon swallowed hard, dropping to one knee. "It's all right," he said, voice trembling. "I've come to take you home. We've driven the Ironborn out." Bran's gaze flicked between Theon and the men behind him, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Slowly, relief washed over the boy's features. Hodder murmured, "Hodder." With quiet gratitude, Theon gently helped Bran into his arms, mindful of the boy's useless legs, and led them back up to the courtyard, where the bodies of Ironborn raiders were being dragged into a pile. Theon's men cheered softly at the sight of the Stark heirs safe. A wave of relief and triumph washed over Theon. He had saved them, rescued the very boys he once called brothers, proving his loyalty to House Stark in the face of his father's invasion. But Winterfell bore the scars of assault. Parts of the walls were blackened with soot, a few towers had collapsed in the fighting, and many of Winterfell's people lay dead or wounded. Maester Luwin was found among the injured, stabbed in the shoulder, but alive. With the Ironborn gone, Theon took charge of the castle's immediate needs, ordering the gates to be repaired and the fires put out. Ser Roderick Castle lay among the fallen, having been cut down early in the assault, and Theon felt a pang of deep sadness at the sight of the old knight's lifeless eyes. The man had once taught Theon the sword. That day, Winterfell wept for its dead. In the weeks that followed, Theon worked tirelessly to bring order back to the stronghold. Letters were sent to Robb and Lady Catelyn, informing them of the rescue. The Outriders patrolled the nearby lands for any other Ironborn raiding parties. Word spread across the north that Theon Greyjoy had recaptured Winterfell from his own father's men. Many Northerners still eyed him with suspicion, but others began to speak with reluctant respect. "Perhaps he is more wolf than kraken," some whispered. Theon tried not to show how much that meant to him. Bran and Rickon looked up to him now, in the absence of their older siblings. They had lost so much. Both parents gone, Sansa and Arya in the south, who knew what dangers they faced, and Theon found himself awkwardly playing the role of protector. He tried to cheer Rickon with small gifts, wooden carvings of direwolves he had one of the carpenter's fashion, though Rickon's gloom lingered in his young face. Bran, confined to his chair, spent hours with Maester Luwin, who told him stories of ancient days, trying to distract him from nightmares of the Ironborn assault. Sometimes Theon sat with them, quiet, letting Bran ask him question after question about the battles he had seen. As winter's chill sank its teeth into the land, the choice fell to Theon whether to remain at Winterfell or attempt to strike out and recapture other northern holdings the Ironborn had seized. House Mormont had been hit hard on Bear Island, and Deepwood Motte was said to be in Ironborn hands. Theon knew that any attempt to sail there would require ships, and the nearest were in White Harbor, under House Manderly's banner. Yet the thought of leading men against his father's raiders only sharpened his resolve. He had cut himself free from the Greyjoy name by driving a sword through Dagmar Cleftjaw's chest. Let Balon curse him from Pike. Theon's loyalty was here. He called a council in the Great Hall, a small assembly of the local lords and ladies who had come to see the young Stark boys safe and to determine how to defend the north. Lady Donella Hornwood was there, though her grief was raw at the death of her husband in the war. Lord Wyman Manderley sent envoys. Each looked to Theon, for though Bran was the rightful Stark in Winterfell, the boy was too young to command armies. And so Theon stood near the high seat, though he did not sit in it, feeling the echo of history in these halls. He saw the ghosts of Eddard Stark and his own younger self, laughing with Robb. The memory tightened his throat. "We will not bow to the Iron Islands," Theon told the gathered lords. His voice rang with a conviction that surprised even himself. "They have no claim here. This is the North, ruled by the king in the North, Robb Stark. Balon Greyjoy broke the peace when he attacked our lands, and we will see him pay for it. But first, we must strengthen our defenses. Winterfell's walls must be repaired, the granaries restocked. Our folk will need shelter if the war continues to rage on." Some among them seemed discomfited by the presence of an Ironborn speaking such words. But then Lady Hornwood stood. "I lost family to your father's raiders," she said in a trembling voice. "Yet you saved the sons of Eddard Stark, and for that, my anger at you is lessened. I will support your plan." Others concurred. The hall reached a tentative accord. Theon was to act as castellan in Robb's absence, caretaker of Winterfell and the two youngest Starks until Robb or Lady Catelyn arrived. Messengers went out to gather troops to push the Ironborn back from other holdings, with Theon's men coordinating whenever possible. The north was vast and winter was near, so such an operation would be arduous, but at least there was unity in the cause. When the Ravens returned from the south, they carried Robb's response: gratitude, relief, and a solemn vow that he would come north as soon as he was able. But the war demanded his presence in the Riverlands, where Tywin Lannister threatened to overrun the Tullis. Robb could only spare a token force to hold Moat Cailin if Theon could pry it from the Ironborn's grip. Theon understood the magnitude of what was being asked. Moat Cailin was the key to the north, a bottleneck that could decide the entire war if the Ironborn entrenched themselves there. A second letter arrived from Pike, a curt missive from Balon Greyjoy himself, though Theon recognized his sister Asha's handwriting too, scrawled in the margins. "Come home, boy," was all Balon's letter said. "Reclaim your birthright and stand with your true people. The North will fall as it has fallen before. Do not die a wolf's death in a foreign land." Under it, in a sharper hand, Asha had written, "Father rages. He wants the North. You are either our enemy or our blood. Choose wisely." Theon burned the letter in the courtyard brazier, refusing to let the words seep too deeply into him. He might have felt a pang for Asha, for she was the only family member he held any warmth for. But Winterfell's battered towers and the memory of Bran and Rickon trembling in the crypts hardened his heart. He had made his choice, so the winter days fell into a pattern of mustering men, repairing Winterfell, and preparing for a thrust south to dislodge the Ironborn from Moat Cailin. Theon dispatched outriders to scout the region, to see how many raiders held the ruins. Each day brought new difficulties. Crops burned, villages ransacked. The small folk looked to Winterfell for guidance. It dawned on Theon how lordly responsibilities weighed on a man's shoulders. A part of him relished the authority, but a deeper part trembled at the thought of failing these people who had no one else to defend them. Bran Stark watched him from his wheeled chair. The boy had grown quieter since the Ironborn attack, haunted by nightmares of men with drowned god symbols carved into their armor. Sometimes Theon found Bran out in the Godswood, conversing softly with Hodder, or with the direwolves, Summer and Shaggy Dog, who prowled the edges of the trees. Bran asked Theon questions about the Iron Islands, about the drowned god and the sea. Theon answered in the best ways he could, though it stirred uncomfortable memories. Bran's eyes always seemed distant afterward, as if seeing something beyond Theon's words. Rickon, on the other hand, followed Theon around like a restless pup. The boy was too young to grasp all that had transpired, but he knew enough to understand that Theon had saved them. Sometimes Theon would catch Rickon playing at swords with a wooden blade, charging at imaginary Ironborn. It reminded Theon of his own boyhood fantasies, and he did not quite know whether to smile or grieve. Soon enough, Theon assembled a small force to march on Moat Cailin. Lady Hornwood contributed a few knights, House Manderley sent foot soldiers, and a handful of other lesser houses rallied. It was a modest host, no more than 500 strong, but they had the advantage of local knowledge and supply lines from Winterfell. Before leaving, Theon entrusted the care of Bran and Rickon to Maester Luwin, as well as a small but loyal garrison. He left behind enough seasoned men to quell any resurgence of Ironborn infiltration, but he knew, in the quiet of his heart, how vulnerable Winterfell might still be if new enemies arrived. War was a chaos with too many moving parts, yet duty called him forward. They marched along the King's Road, the breath of winter swirling around them. Hoarfrost clung to the trees, and the streams ran cold. As they approached Moat Caelin's boggy surrounds, the land turned treacherous, marshy ground that could swallow a man whole if he stepped unwisely. Theon sent scouts ahead, and they returned with news. Perhaps 200 Ironborn held the ruin, having set up blockades on the causeway. They had archers in the tumbled towers, and the approach was well guarded. But Theon knew that Moat Caelin, for all its strategic import, was not easily defended by a small force once an enemy was determined to root them out. Theon had only to apply enough pressure to force a retreat or a surrender. This was not going to be a grand siege so much as a cunning assault. He devised a plan to strike at dawn, using the marshes to approach the ruin from multiple angles. He split his host into 3 groups, each guided by men who knew the quagmires well. He himself would command the center group, aiming for the old gatehouse. When the Ironborn were distracted by the frontal assault, the other 2 groups would flank them from the sides, using hidden paths among the reeds. The night before the attack, Theon sat by a small fire, turning over his sword in his hands. He thought of how Ned Stark had once admonished him to keep his blade clean and sharp, for a blade that is poorly kept is an insult to the craftsman and to those who rely on it. There was a quiet dread in Theon's heart. This time, he was not defending a castle he knew intimately. He was going on the offensive, pitting loyal Northmen against Ironborn raiders who might once have been his kinsmen. The possibility that his sister Asha could be among them lurked in his thoughts. He doubted Balon would send Asha so far from Deepwood Motte, but war was unpredictable. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that he was doing this for the only family who had truly cared for him. He carried the memory of Bran and Rickon's frightened faces in the crypt, the memory of Ser Roderick Castle's body among the dead. There could be no turning back. Dawn broke thin and gray, the sun a mere white disk behind banks of cloud. Theon's host advanced. The wetlands swallowed the sound of hooves and boots in certain stretches, while in others the mud sucked at their steps, forcing them to move carefully. Theon's heart pounded as Moat Caelin's broken silhouette came into view, a once proud fortress whose remaining towers jutted skyward like broken teeth. The banners of the Kraken hung limp from the ramparts. Archers perched on the walls, scanning the horizon. Theon raised his hand, signaling his men to halt, then motioned the flanking groups forward. They would circle around, creeping through the marsh. A hush fell over the company. The wind sighed through the tall grass. Theon's mouth felt dry. He waited for a cry of alarm from the Ironborn, for a horn blast that would signal they had been spotted. But nothing came. Slowly, Theon advanced, keeping his force in the cover of scattered trees and reeds. The closer they got, the more his heart thundered. When at last they were in range, Theon notched an arrow, took aim at an Ironborn scout on the parapet. He exhaled slowly and loosed. The arrow soared. The scout toppled with a cry. In that instant, the Northmen let out a fierce shout, and the charge began. They rushed the ruin, boots splashing through muddy pools. The Ironborn scrambled to their posts, horns sounding. Arrows rained down from the walls. Theon dove behind a broken section of masonry, returning fire with a snarl. All around him, men screamed and metal clashed. He glimpsed a few Ironborn rushing to bar the gatehouse, but the sturdy oak doors had rotted half off their hinges, making them a poor defense. Theon and his men forced the gate with a battering ram, piling into the courtyard. The fight was brutal. The Ironborn were veterans of raids and excelled in close combat. But the Northmen, filled with righteous fury, outnumbered them. The flanking groups emerged from behind the towers, catching the defenders in a pincer. The courtyard devolved into a mess of swirling combat. Theon shot arrow after arrow, each one seeking an ironborn target. He watched men he knew from Winterfell go down, but he also saw the ironborn ranks shrinking, battered from all sides. Suddenly, a fierce roar cut through the din. One of the ironborn captains, a tall, broad man with a beard braided in rings of iron, charged at Theon, swinging a massive war axe. Theon fumbled for his sword, having just loosed an arrow, and barely parried the first blow. The force of it jarred his arm. The captain sneered. "Greyjoy," he spat. "Traitor." The next swing nearly took Theon's head off, but he managed to duck. The axe slammed into the stone behind him, sparks flying. Seizing the moment, Theon drove his blade into the man's side. Blood erupted, and the captain staggered, falling to one knee. Theon finished him, breath ragged. When it was done, the Ironborn who remained threw down their weapons. Moat Cailin was recaptured. Dead lay strewn among the ruins, but the North's banner was raised once more. Theon's men cheered, though the elation was tempered by weariness and grief for the fallen. Theon wiped the blood from his cheek, wincing at a fresh cut, and breathed the cold morning air, feeling a shuddering relief flood him. Moat Cailin belonged to the North again. Among the prisoners, Theon looked for any sign of his sister, but saw only grim, faceless, ironborn men. He interrogated a few, demanding to know Asha's whereabouts, but they claimed ignorance. "Likely at Deepwood Motte," one prisoner grunted. "She's not fool enough to get stuck here." Theon felt a curious mix of disappointment and relief. He nodded to his men to secure the prisoners. He knew not what Robb would do with them. Some might be useful as bargaining chips or set to forced labor. Theon's priority was to hold Moat Cailin now, to prevent another Ironborn incursion into the North. He left a garrison behind, commanded by a stout man named Lord Serwyn, who had proven capable. The plan was to fortify the ruins as best they could. Then Theon, battered but unbroken, led the rest of his men back toward Winterfell, carrying news of their victory. The ride north was somber, passing through once thriving villages that bore the marks of Ironborn raiders. Crops had been burned, livestock scattered, and the small folk eyed Theon warily, unsure whether to curse him or thank him. He offered what food they could spare and pointed them to Winterfell's safety. Each new tragedy he witnessed stiffened his resolve. When at last the gray walls of Winterfell came into sight, Theon felt a weary homecoming. He rode through the gates with his men behind him, and the small folk rushed to greet them. Bran waited in the courtyard, guarded by the direwolves. Even Rickon was there, bouncing on his toes. "Well?" Bran asked anxiously, as Theon dismounted. Theon offered a small, tired grin. "Moat Cailin is ours." A cheer went up among the gathered folk. Bran's face lit with relief, and Rickon gave a whoop of delight. Maester Luwin clasped Theon's arm warmly, but Theon could see the sadness in his eyes for the men who would not return. War was not glorious, Theon realized. War was survival and heartbreak. In the days that followed, Winterfell became a beacon of hope for the North. Word of Theon's recapture of Moat Cailin spread. Ravens flew south to Robb Stark, bearing news of the success. Balon Greyjoy's invasion had stalled. His men held only scattered outposts along the west coast, plus Deepwood Motte where Asha Greyjoy was rumored to command. The fighting continued, but the advantage belonged to the North, which now had a rallying point and a line of defense at Moat Cailin. Yet Theon knew the war was far from finished. Balon was stubborn, and Asha was cunning. If they entrenched themselves in the western strongholds, the North would bleed for years to come. And the rest of the realm was still in chaos, with the Lannisters and Tyrells pressing King's Landing's advantage, Stannis Baratheon licking his wounds after the Blackwater fiasco, and the king in the North forced to divide his attention between the Riverlands and his homeland. Every raven from the south carried more tidings of battles, alliances, betrayals. One crisp morning, as frost glittered on the courtyard stones, Theon stood on the ramparts gazing out. He saw the farmland stretching beyond the walls, skeletal trees half buried in snow. He remembered the first time he came to Winterfell, the wariness in his heart. He had never imagined himself in a position of leadership here. He had never imagined he would be forced to fight his own people to protect these walls and the boys within them. But time changed all men, shaping them like a blacksmith's hammer. Theon could only hope he had been tempered into something strong, rather than brittle metal waiting to shatter. Bran joined him, Hodder pushing the wheeled chair as far as it would go, then standing awkwardly nearby. Summer trotted along, nose sniffing the cold air. Bran looked down at the courtyard where Rickon played with a wooden sword. "Do you think Robb will come soon?" Bran asked quietly, his breath plumed in the cold. "I believe so," Theon said. "He has to keep the Lannisters at bay, but he'll come as soon as he can." He glanced at Bran, noticing how the boy's face had lost much of its childish roundness. "You miss him." "I miss them all," Bran replied, voice subdued. "Sometimes I have dreams. I can't explain them, but I dream of ravens and wolves and trees with faces, and I see them all, scattered in different parts of the world. I don't know if it's real or just a dream." Theon recalled that the Starks had their own connection to the old gods. He thought of the weirwood in the gods' wood, silent and watchful. He wanted to comfort Bran, but words failed him. Instead, he just placed a hand on Bran's shoulder. "They'll return," he murmured. "We'll endure until they do. That's what the North does." Bran nodded, but there was a faraway look in his eyes, as though he glimpsed something beyond the walls, some truth Theon could not see. Time wore on and the winter deepened. White winds howled across the battlements. Food grew scarcer. Theon oversaw rationing, ensuring that stores were equitably distributed. He also saw to the training of new recruits, young men and older boys who had never swung a real sword in their lives, but who volunteered to defend the castle. Each day, Theon walked among them, barking orders, correcting their form with a patience he had not known he possessed. He still wore the Kraken sigil beneath his cloak, though rarely displayed it openly. More often, the direwolf banner rippled over him, symbol of the home he had chosen. Sometimes, after a long day drilling recruits or reviewing supply ledgers, Theon found himself alone in his chamber, lit by a single candle. He would sit on the edge of his bed, battered sword resting at his feet, and feel an ache in his chest. He missed the simpler days, when he and Robb hunted in the Wolfswood, teasing Jon or playfully wrestling in the courtyard. He missed the sense of belonging that came without question. Now, though people gave him respect, he sensed that some still doubted him or feared what he might do. He wondered if he could ever truly escape the shadow of Balon Greyjoy and the stigma of Ironborn cruelty. One night, he awoke in a cold sweat, dreaming of crashing waves and a man's voice that sounded like thunder calling him a traitor. He rubbed his face, heart racing, and gazed into the darkness. Winterfell's stones surrounded him, but in his mind, he was lost at sea, battered between two worlds. With a bitter sigh, he rose and went to the window. The courtyard lay silent, the moonlight reflecting off new-fallen snow. It was beautiful in a somber way. He breathed the cold air, and in the distance, a lone wolf howled. Theon closed his eyes, letting that howl reverberate in his soul. Dawn brought another raven from the south. News that Robb Stark had reached the twins to treat with Walder Frey and might soon march north. Theon read the letter twice, relief warring with apprehension. The Freys were notoriously fickle, and Theon did not trust them. But if Robb was returning, perhaps the North could unify and drive out the Ironborn once and for all. Theon felt a swell of anticipation. He longed to see his friend again, to see the king in the North stride through Winterfell's gates in triumph. But war seldom granted easy reunions. As the weeks passed, Theon readied the castle for Robb's arrival, ensuring that there was shelter and enough provisions to house additional troops. One frosty afternoon, a sentry on the outer wall hailed that a party was approaching from the south. Theon felt his heart leap. He donned his cloak, buckled his sword belt, and hurried down to the courtyard. Bran was already there, bundled against the cold, with Rickon fidgeting at his side. The gates were drawn open, and a column of riders trotted in. At their head, Theon recognized Lord Bolton's banner and the pale Leech Lord himself, Roose Bolton, silent and watchful. Alongside him rode a man Theon did not recognize. Tall, with a cruel smirk and eyes that glinted with cunning. Their retinue wore the flayed man's sigil. Theon's stomach twisted. No banner of the wolf was visible. No sign of Robb Stark. Yet Bolton carried a missive with the king in the North Seal. The courtyard grew silent. Bolton dismounted gracefully. His men spread out behind him, and Theon noticed that they were armed and seemed more numerous than the few Winterfell guards present. The tension thickened. Maester Luwin approached politely to greet the lord. Bolton nodded in that eerie, measured way. His lips curled into something resembling a smile. "I bring word from our king," he announced in his soft voice, which forced everyone to strain to hear. He produced a sealed letter. "Lord Greyjoy, if you would." Theon stepped forward, keeping his face neutral. He accepted the letter. The broken seal showed the Stark direwolf. The handwriting was indeed Robb's. Theon read it carefully. It spoke of an arrangement with Lord Bolton and an upcoming campaign. Theon frowned. The words were curt, almost mechanical. Something about it felt off, as though it had been dictated, or coerced, or written under duress. The mention of an alliance with the Dreadfort set Theon's nerves on edge. He forced a pleasant expression. "Where is King Robb?" Bolton's pale eyes flicked to Theon. "He remains in the field, securing the final negotiations," he replied smoothly. "He instructed me to ride ahead and ensure Winterfell's compliance with certain new arrangements. You have done well holding this castle, but your services here are no longer required." A hush fell. Theon noted the uneasy shifting of Bolton's men, the glances they exchanged. Something was very wrong. Theon's mind flashed to stories he had heard of the Boltons, how they once wore the flayed skins of their enemies and how they coveted the seat of the Starks. Tension radiated through the courtyard. Bran's hand gripped the arm of his chair. Rickon looked at Theon with wide, confused eyes. "My Lord Bolton," Theon said, forcing measured politeness. "Winterfell belongs to House Stark. I serve Robb in holding it until he returns." Bolton's smile was thin as a razor. "Of course you do, but the tides of war bring changes. We will speak further inside, away from this biting cold." He gestured, and the tall man beside him dismounted. "This is my son, Ramsay Snow." A flicker of recognition dawned on Theon. He had heard rumors of the bastard of Bolton, cruelty incarnate, a sadistic whelp. Now those rumors seemed to come to life in that smirking face. Theon felt his hackles rise. Behind him, Winterfell's small garrison stood uncertainly, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Theon realized in a rush of panic that he had never anticipated a betrayal from his fellow Northerners. He had been so fixated on the threat of the Ironborn that he did not see the viper in his own midst. Roose Bolton gave a nod to his son, and Ramsay sauntered forward, hand drifting to the hilt of a nasty-looking blade. Theon swallowed hard. They were inside Winterfell's walls, seemingly by invitation. If this was a betrayal, they already had the upper hand. Theon moved slightly to place himself between Bolton's men and Bran and Rickon. The courtyard remained still as the dawn light glinted off the steel of many swords. "Shall we speak inside?" Bolton repeated quietly with a certain finality. "We have many matters to discuss. Your status, your father's invasion, the future of Winterfell." Theon realized he had little choice but to comply, at least until he understood the shape of Bolton's betrayal. He nodded, and the group moved into the great hall, tension coiling with every step. The house guards that Theon trusted followed warily, but they were few in number compared to Bolton's men. Maester Luwin, pale-faced, hurried to Bran's chair, while Rickon trotted alongside, eyes darting fearfully from one flayed man banner to another. Inside the hall, the hearths roared, but the fire seemed to bring no warmth. Bolton took a seat near the high table, gesturing for Theon to join him. Ramsay hovered behind his father, a mocking grin on his lips. Theon stood, refusing to sit, arms folded across his chest in a show of defiance. He thought of the blade at his hip. If it came to a fight, he would likely die, but not before taking at least one Bolton with him. According to our king's wishes, Bolton began, Winterfell shall pass to my stewardship until the war's end. I am to ensure the safety of Lord Bran and Lord Rickon Stark, and oversee the subjugation of any remaining Ironborn threats. Robb Stark's command is clear. You, Theon Greyjoy, are to defer to me in all matters of governance, or face the consequences. Theon's lips pressed into a thin line. With all due respect, I find that difficult to believe. Robb would not simply hand Winterfell to you, especially not without giving me direct orders. Bolton shrugged with a well-practiced air of feigned regret. War forces many difficult decisions. We Boltons have pledged our swords to the king in the north, but the north is in chaos. His Grace likely thought it best to place the seat in the hands of a time-honored northern house, rather than... He paused, letting the unspoken slur hang in the air. A Greyjoy. Ramsay snickered quietly behind his father. Time-honored. Flayed and tanned, more like... He muttered, just loud enough for Theon to hear. Theon's pulse hammered. He forced himself to remain calm. I will not relinquish Winterfell without reading these commands for myself. The letter you gave me was short and vague. Perhaps you should show me all of the king's instructions. Bolton's smile was cold. Alas, the rest were verbal instructions. He tilted his head. You can refuse, of course. But that would be rebellion against our king's appointed representative, would it not? Theon's jaw tightened. He glanced at Bran, whose eyes were wide with apprehension. The boy was wise enough to read the situation for what it was. A trap. Theon realized that if he defied Bolton openly, the Great Hall would turn into a slaughterhouse, with Bran and Rickon caught in the crossfire. Maester Luwin cleared his throat nervously, stepping forward. My Lord Bolton, if there is to be a transfer of authority, we must be certain of its legitimacy. Winterfell is the ancestral seat of House Stark. Ramsay's hand shot out, grabbing the maester by the front of his robe. You dare question my Lord Father? He hissed, eyes alight with malice. Luwin paled, sputtering. Before Theon could intercede, Bolton raised a hand, and Ramsay released the maester with a shove. Bolton stood, smoothing an invisible crease in his cloak. Lord Greyjoy, he said softly, if you value the safety of these Stark boys, you will yield Winterfell without a fight. Otherwise, their blood will be on your hands. He flicked his gaze to Bran and Rickon, who both looked terrified. They are indispensable bargaining chips with the Lannisters and other factions. I have no desire to harm them, so long as you comply. Theon felt his blood run cold. For months, he had fought to save these boys from the Ironborn. Now the threat came from within the North itself, from a house sworn to the Starks. Everything he had done, all the battles, the sacrifices, led to this moment. If he tried to defend Winterfell, he might condemn Bran and Rickon to death at Bolton's hands. But if he surrendered, what fate awaited them? Bran met Theon's gaze, as if silently pleading for him to find a solution. Rickon trembled, tears in his eyes, but trying to appear brave. Theon's mind raced. He could not allow the Boltons to seize power uncontested. Robb would never forgive him if he simply handed over his brothers to these flayers. Yet fighting here now would be hopeless. Perhaps there was another way, some ruse, some chance to spirit the boys away. Theon remembered hidden passages beneath Winterfell, rumored tunnels leading outside the walls. He considered it desperately. Could he get them out before Bolton's men realized what was happening? He forced a semblance of composure, bowing stiffly to Bolton. As Castellan, I must ensure a peaceful transfer, if that is indeed the king's will. Let us proceed carefully. I will gather my personal effects and see to it that you and your men are quartered. He clenched his fists behind his back. But I will not abandon the boys. As wards of the castle, I am responsible for them, and I shall remain. Bolton studied Theon's face, calculating. He offered a thin, measured nod. Of course, we would not dream of separating you from them. For now, Ramsay's smirk deepened, and Theon's skin crawled. He realized that the bastard of Bolton was eyeing Bran and Rickon like a hawk studying helpless prey. A shiver of revulsion ran down Theon's spine. He took a step closer to the boys, silently vowing that he would not let Ramsay's cruelty touch them, no matter what it cost him. Thus began a new test of Theon Greyjoy's loyalty and cunning. Saving the Stark boys from Ironborn raiders had been straightforward compared to the subtle, insidious danger posed by House Bolton. Theon had to walk a razor's edge, feigning obedience while searching for a chance to strike back or escape. The days turned tense as Bolton and his son slowly took control of Winterfell's workings. Their men patrolled the corridors, posted guards at every gate, and questioned the servants. The flayed man banner was raised alongside the dire wolf, a ghastly sight that filled the courtyard with an air of dread. Bran and Rickon were kept in their own chambers, but Bolton insisted that, for their protection, the boys remain under constant guard. Theon used every excuse to stay near them, claiming that as a longtime companion and protector, he was best suited to keep the boys calm. Bolton allowed it, perhaps hoping to manipulate Theon through his feelings for the Stark children. Ramsay, meanwhile, seemed to relish making Theon uncomfortable. He prowled the halls at odd hours, threatened the servants with torture if they displeased him, and bragged about his dogs, giant, vicious hounds that he claimed would love to chase little wolves. Fury roiled in Theon. He was trapped in a fortress he had fought so hard to protect, forced to watch these vipers coil around the heart of the North. Each night, he lay awake, considering how to wrest Winterfell from their clutches. With the majority of the garrison either at Moat Cailin or stationed in the outlying areas, Theon had few loyal men inside the castle. Bolton had come with hundreds. A direct confrontation was suicide. Yet Theon could not simply bow forever. He devised a plan in hushed whispers with Maester Luwin, who also loathed the Boltons' presence. They would attempt to smuggle Bran and Rickon out of Winterfell through the crypts. Hodder would carry Bran, and Theon would guide them through the winding passages until they emerged outside the walls. Then they would find a way to reach either White Harbor or Moat Cailin, somewhere they could rally help. The risk was tremendous, but every day, Ramsay drew closer to doing something monstrous to the boys, as though eager to prove his power. Time was running out. On a frigid, moonless night, Theon set the plan in motion. He cornered two of his most trusted guards, men who had followed him since the Moat Cailin campaign. He swore them to secrecy and told them to be ready at the crypt entrance, disguised as Bolton guards if need be. Maester Luwin made a show of bringing a sleeping draught to Bran's chambers, as though to help the boy rest, but inside was a subtle stimulant to ensure Bran stayed alert for the journey. Rickon, though young, was instructed to remain perfectly silent. They would move just after midnight, when the guards were at their drowsiest. At the appointed hour, Theon slipped quietly into the corridor. The torches burned low, casting flickering shadows. He nodded at Maester Luwin, who stood watch near Bran's door. Together, they ushered Hodder, Bran, and Rickon out into the hallway. Rickon clutched his wooden direwolf toy, knuckles white. Bran's eyes were wide in the gloom. They moved swiftly, with Theon leading the way, keeping to side passages. Twice they had to duck behind an alcove when Bolton guards came by, but the cloaks they wore helped them blend into the darkness. Theon's heart pounded at every step, expecting any moment to see Ramsay's sadistic grin appear out of nowhere. At last they reached the entrance to the crypts, that ancient door set in the ground beyond the broken tower. The two loyal guards stood by, watchful. One nodded at Theon. Quietly, they lifted the heavy iron gate and descended the winding steps, the chill of the crypt enveloping them. Torchlight flickered on the stone kings and lords of Winterfell, whose statues lined the walls, each with a direwolf at their feet. The old black tombs loomed, silent witnesses to the living. Bran breathed raggedly, and Rickon clung to Hodder's leg. They went deeper, past the entombed monarchs, looking for a side passage rumored to lead outside the walls. The Starks had built many secret ways. Theon had learned of them from an old story once told by Old Nan, and Maester Luwin had found references in ancient records. But the crypts were a labyrinth. Each turn looked the same, each statue a silent sentinel. Theon whispered for calm, trying to remember the details. They found a small archway half concealed by rubble, and Theon's heart soared with hope. This had to be it. Suddenly, distant torchlight flickered against the stone. Footsteps echoed from behind them. Someone else was down here. Theon tensed, motioning the group to douse their torch. Darkness swallowed them. Rickon whimpered softly, and Theon placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, urging silence. They heard voices, Bolton guards, perhaps, or worse, Ramsay himself. Theon felt sweat trickle down his temple despite the cold. They pressed themselves against the wall, hearts pounding. The footsteps grew closer, then paused. For a moment, it seemed the intruders might turn away. Then a torch flared, revealing Ramsay Snow's face just a few yards away, twisted in triumph. "Well, well," he purred. "Where are you going at this hour, little wolves?" Bolton men flooded in behind him, steel glinting in the firelight. Theon cursed, stepping forward with his sword drawn. "Let us pass," he hissed, voice low, "or I will cut you down." Ramsay laughed, a high, cruel sound. "You think you'll keep me from my prizes? My father was right to suspect your loyalty. I've been following you for days, waiting for you to betray us." His eyes gleamed. "Did you really think you could spirit them away so easily? These walls have ears, Greyjoy." A savage fight broke out in the depths of the crypt. Theon's two guards rushed forward, steel clashing in the narrow passage. Ramsay's men outnumbered them, but the tight quarters blunted that advantage somewhat. Theon lunged at Ramsay, swords ringing. Ramsay parried with surprising skill, though Theon noted a sadistic glee in his eyes that suggested he enjoyed drawing out the fight. Bran cried out, and Theon risked a glance. Maester Luwin and Hodder were trying to pull the boys back, but other Bolton men flanked them. One guard slashed at Hodder, opening a bloody gash in the big man's shoulder. Hodder roared in pain, stumbling. Rickon screamed. The crypt's darkness shimmered with chaos. Ramsay pressed Theon hard, forcing him back toward the tomb walls. "All this trouble for the sake of two crippled pups," Ramsay sneered, lashing out with a ferocious cut. Theon blocked, but the force rattled his arm. "Are you truly a Greyjoy? Or did Ned Stark geld you along with your loyalty?" With a snarl, Theon smashed the pommel of his sword into Ramsay's face, sending him staggering. Then Theon drove his shoulder forward, attempting to tackle him, but Ramsay twisted free. The fight continued, both men panting, neither able to land a killing blow. Behind them, Theon's two loyal guards had been cut down, and Maester Luwin lay crumpled against a statue, unmoving. Hodder, blood streaming from his arm, tried to shield Bran and Rickon from three advancing Bolton soldiers, but it was hopeless. At last, Ramsay outmaneuvered Theon, hooking a foot behind Theon's ankle. Theon stumbled, and Ramsay's blade slashed across his side, drawing blood. Theon gasped, dropping to one knee. Ramsay laughed, raising his sword for the finishing blow. "Good night, traitor," he hissed. But in that instant, a deep growl echoed through the crypt. Out of the darkness lunged Summer and Shaggy Dog, the direwolves. They tore into the Bolton men, fangs flashing, savage in their defense of their masters. The watchers could do nothing but cry out as the wolves ripped flesh and drew screams from the men. Ramsay turned, startled, and Theon saw his opening. Summoning his last strength, Theon thrust his sword up into Ramsay's exposed side. Ramsay coughed wetly, eyes bulging in shock, and then collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. More Bolton men rushed in, but the direwolf's ferocity gave them pause. Theon struggled to his feet, wound, at side burning. Hodder picked up a fallen sword, swinging it wildly, tears on his face. Theon shouted for them to retreat further into the crypt. Yet Bolton's men blocked the way they had come, and the direwolves could only hold them off for so long. Then Theon heard a cruel, quiet voice from behind the group. Roose Bolton himself, stepping through the archway, flanked by more soldiers. "So unfortunate," Bolton murmured, regarding his fallen son with something akin to mild annoyance. "You killed my heir, Greyjoy. I suppose that means you have no value now but as a hostage. Surrender or the boys die." Theon panted, sword trembling in his hand. Around him, the direwolves snarled, but the Bolton soldiers had crossbows now, aiming at the wolves' flanks. One bolt whistled past Shaggydog's ear. If Theon kept fighting, Bran and Rickon would almost certainly be shot down or devoured by the madness of battle. He saw no escape, no route to safety. The crypt had turned into a tomb for his hopes. His voice hoarse, Theon let his sword clatter to the ground. "Spare them," he demanded, tears mingling with sweat. "They're just children." Bolton's eyes were like chips of ice. "Children of Eddard Stark. They are precious commodities. I won't harm them, unless you force my hand again. But your life is mine now, Greyjoy." Across the crypt, Bran clung to Rickon, tears streaking both their faces. Hodder moaned in pain. Summer and Shaggydog paced anxiously, uncertain whether to attack. Roose Bolton's men surged forward, seizing Theon, wrenching his arms behind him. A kick to his wounded side brought him to his knees with a choked cry. Bolton's men forcibly subdued the direwolves with snares and threats of crossbow bolts, driving them back. Soon, Theon was bound, blood oozing from his side, while the Stark children were ushered away under guard. Roose Bolton stood in the darkness, gazing impassively at the statue of some long-dead Stark lord. And so the crypts of Winterfell bore witness to a cruel turning in Theon Greyjoy's story. He had stayed in Winterfell, defied his father's legacy, rescued Bran and Rickon from the Ironborn, and held the castle through the winter's trials. Yet in the end, betrayal came not from across the sea but from within the North itself. House Bolton had seized the moment to twist the war to its advantage, capturing the Stark heirs and subjugating Winterfell. And Theon, who had tried to protect them, now knelt in chains at Roose Bolton's feet, uncertain whether Robb Stark was still alive, uncertain if any help might come in time. The snows fell heavier in the days that followed, blanketing Winterfell's walls in pale silence. Beyond those walls, the War of the Five Kings raged on. Theon could only pray that somewhere, Robb Stark was preparing to unleash the wolf's wrath on traitors in his midst. He could only pray that, even in the face of flayed men and treachery, the North would remember. And as he knelt in the gloom, he thought of that moment so many months ago when he had told Robb he would not return to Pike. He had chosen his path and it led him here, to heartbreak and darkness. Yet somewhere in his wounded spirit, a faint spark of resolve flickered. He had promised to protect these boys, these Starks who had been more of a family to him than his own. He would not let the Boltons snuff that spark out. If he lived, he would find a way to save them, even if it cost him everything. He was Theon Greyjoy, ward of Ned Stark, brother-in-arms to the king in the north. The Ironborn in him might have been shaped by salt and rock, but his heart had been formed within these ancient walls. No matter what torment the Boltons inflicted, he would remember that. And so, as the crypts loomed around him and the ghosts of Winterfell bore silent witness, Theon clung to that last ember of defiance, waiting for the day when the tide would turn again. In the dimly lit corridors beneath Winterfell, where old bones slept in crypts and the chill of the northern earth seeped through every stone, Theon Greyjoy found himself bound in chains. His knees pressed against the cold ground, and a raw ache radiated from the deep slash Ramsay snow had carved into his side during their desperate struggle in the dark. The coppery scent of his own blood mingled with damp stone and ancient dust. He had surrendered his sword to save Bran and Rickon Stark. He had failed to spirit them away before the bastard of Bolton and his men closed in. Now, as the flicker of torchlight revealed the grim faces of Roose Bolton's soldiers, Theon waited for whatever vile fate they intended for him. Roose Bolton himself stood among the tombs, bearing that expression of cool detachment he wore like a second skin. He gazed impassively at the body of his son, Ramsay, sprawled on the ground where Theon's sword had found its mark. The bastard of Bolton still clutched his blade in one stiffening hand, face contorted in an eternal grimace. He had died with surprise in his eyes, as though unable to believe anyone could have beaten him. Across the crypt, a handful of Bolton soldiers had forced the direwolves, Summer and Shaggydog, back at arrow point. Both wolves snarled, ears pinned to their skulls, but they did not lunge again, not while the children they protected stood in the crossfire. Bran and Rickon were gathered against a stone sepulchre, guarded by men wearing the flayed man's sigil upon their chests. Hodder knelt beside the boys, blood seeping from a vicious cut in his shoulder. Maester Luwin lay unconscious, or near enough to it, propped against a statue of a long-dead Stark lord. 2 of Theon's loyal guards were dead, their blood staining the crypt's floor. A hush pressed down upon them all, broken only by Summer's growl. Slowly, Roose Bolton turned from his son's corpse and gave a measured glance at Theon, still on his knees. There was neither grief nor rage in Bolton's pale eyes. If he felt any sorrow over losing Ramsay, it was buried deep beneath layers of calculation. After a moment, he exhaled, a tiny sound that might have been annoyance or acceptance. Then he nodded to the nearest soldier. "Bind him tight. Tend his wound so he does not bleed out. We have use for him yet." 2 men seized Theon's arms, wrenching them behind his back and forcing him fully prone. He let out a grunt of pain when a gauntlet hand pressed hard against the slash in his side. His vision swam with fresh agony, and he felt warm blood trickle against his skin. Bolton's men wrapped his wrists and ankles in stiff cords and stuffed a rag into his mouth to stifle any cry. "Not here," Roose Bolton said quietly, his soft voice carrying in the crypt's hush. "We will move them all upstairs. Gentle with the Starks, no bruises." His gaze flicked to the 2 frightened boys. "Lord Bran, Lord Rickon, Hodder, and that maester. If the maester dies, so be it, but keep him alive if possible. He may still be needed." A soldier stepped forward, grim-faced, to yank Theon upright. Another rummaged for strips of cloth to bind Theon's side. The makeshift dressing was done hurriedly, with neither care nor cleanliness. Theon's vision blurred from the pain, but he refused to let out anything more than a muffled groan behind the rag. His thoughts spun. He had failed to save the boys. He had sworn to protect them. Now, they were at the mercy of a man rumored to be far more dangerous than any Ironborn raider. A flicker of guilt crossed Theon's mind as they hauled him toward the crypt's exit. He tried to find Bran's gaze in the shifting darkness, to somehow communicate a promise that it was not over. Bran's eyes, wide with terror, met his for a moment, and Theon could only blink once in a mute vow. It was all he could manage before the soldiers half-dragged him up the worn stone steps, away from the hidden tombs and into the torchlit corridors of Winterfell above. They emerged into a corridor quiet but for the echoes of distant footfalls and the whispering of Bolton men stationed at every corner. Winterfell, Theon realized, was wholly theirs. Roose Bolton had used cunning, some letter of Robb's, likely forged or wrung from him under duress, to gain entry. Now the great hall, the corridors, every tower and battlement belonged to the flayed man. The direwolf banner might yet fly overhead, but in truth, the fortress served House Bolton. Theon pictured the swirl of snow outside, the bitter wind scouring the winter sky, and felt dread coil in his stomach. He had not seen winter like this in years, not since he was a boy. The thought of being locked in some dungeon, possibly tortured, possibly used as a pawn, his mind recoiled. But more than his own fate, he feared for Bran and Rickon. They were led through the yard, blanketed in a thin layer of new-fallen snow. Torches flared, and Theon caught glimpses of battered gatehouses and partial repairs to walls still blackened from the Ironborn siege. It wounded him to see how far Winterfell had fallen, when all he had done for months was strive to protect it. Bolton's men marched them past clusters of armed guards and onlookers, some of them Winterfell servants who had no choice but to submit. Their faces registered shock and fear as they recognized Theon in chains, along with the injured maester, Hodder, and the 2 Stark boys. Some wept, and some turned their faces away. Another pang of shame stabbed at Theon's gut. He had saved Winterfell from the Ironborn only to lose it to traitors within the north. A horse whinnied somewhere near the stables, as Bolton's men escorted them into the great keep. Here, the corridors were warmer, and the floor was strewn with fresh rushes, signs that the Boltons were quickly making themselves comfortable. Finally, They reached a set of stairs that descended into Winterfell's dungeons. Down they went, step after step, into the stale, cold gloom. Theon's pulse throbbed with dread, but he tried to keep his wits. Perhaps there would be a chance to escape again, some guard who could be bribed, some route left unguarded. If not him, maybe someone else, Mira Reed or other loyal northern allies if they existed nearby. But who knew where the Reeds were, or if they even knew what was happening here? In one cramped corridor lit by flickering lanterns, the group paused. Roose Bolton glided forward, eyeing the line of prisoners. "Separate them," he ordered. "The Stark boys will be housed in a chamber above ground, under guard. Keep them comfortable enough. The big stable boy can stay with them for now. He's too large to handle if we keep him below. As for the maester, let him tend his own wounds in some small cell. Lord Greyjoy," he considered Theon as though assessing a horse's value, "take him to the darkest hole we have. I mean to discuss many things with him once he's a bit more docile." Theon's chains rattled as soldiers forced him onward, down another corridor that seemed carved from raw stone. The ceiling arched low, and a single torch sputtered. The cell they shoved him into was cramped and damp, a square of rough walls with a straw pallet on the floor. They removed the rag from his mouth so he could breathe more easily, but left his wrists bound and locked him behind heavy iron bars. He heard the jingle of keys and the grinding of metal on metal as the door was sealed. He sagged to his knees, drawing in ragged breaths, the pain in his side flaring with every movement. The strip of cloth pressed against the wound was already soaked through with blood. The corridor outside flickered in the faint torchlight, and 2 Bolton guards stationed themselves there, spears in hand. "Best get comfortable," one guard sneered before turning his back. Alone in the gloom, Theon tried to breathe past the pain. His mind roamed over what had gone so terribly wrong. He had fought so hard against the Ironborn, saved Bran and Rickon from Dagmar Cleftjaw, retaken Moat Cailin with the help of good men who followed him. He had done everything in his power to be loyal to the Starks, to stand by Robb even when it meant denying his own father. Now, trapped in a Bolton cell, he might never see the outside world again. The reality was bleak and relentless, yet Theon refused to let despair devour him. He would heal or he would die trying, but while he breathed, there might still be a chance to outmaneuver Roose Bolton. He had not survived the Iron Island's harshness or the war's storms to lie down meekly. Time blurred. Theon drifted in and out of a pained doze, disturbed by the biting cold of the cell. At some point, a guard or a servant peered through the bars. They poured wine onto a rag and pressed it to his wound, making him bite back a scream at the sting. There was no real care in it. The man simply muttered that Lord Bolton had ordered Theon be kept alive. Theon clenched his teeth through the crude ministrations. When they left, the cell door slammed shut again, plunging him into half-darkness illuminated only by the distant torch. Days seemed to pass in that haze. It was hard to mark time when no sunlight reached the dungeon's depths. Occasionally, a guard would bring a bowl of thin stew or stale bread, pushing it through the bars with the tip of a spear. Theon, half delirious with fever, sipped water from a clay cup. Visions and nightmares haunted him, mingling with memories of Pike's bleak shores, the thunder of waves on rock, the faces of Robb, Bran, and Rickon, the swirling bitterness of being a hostage. He dreamed of the crypts and Ramsay's mocking face, and more than once jerked awake with a start, forgetting for a moment that Ramsay was dead and that Roose Bolton was the real threat now. At last, a time came when the guard detail changed, and one of the new arrivals was a quiet, dark-haired youth who seemed less cruel than the rest. As he passed a water skin through the bars, Theon asked in a rasp, What's happening above? The Starks? Are they alive?" The guard gave him a look that was partly pity, partly wariness. "They're alive," he answered in a low voice. "Lord Bolton keeps them in the Lord's chambers, or near enough. The littlest one tries to run sometimes. The older one can't run at all, what with his legs. They keep that big simpleton with them. The maester is locked up in a separate room. I hear they let him treat the boys when they fall ill, but otherwise he's not allowed to roam." Theon's bound hands trembled around the cup. "They're safe," he croaked. "For now." the guard said, looking over his shoulder as if fearful of being overheard. Lord Bolton is forging alliances. I hear talk that the Freys are in negotiation with him, that something has happened in the south. Your king in the north. There's rumor he's lost half his bannermen. And I hear King's Landing stands strong under that boy king's rule, with the Tyrells at his side. A wave of dread washed over Theon. He had heard no tidings of the war for weeks. If Robb Stark's cause was faltering, it might explain why Roose Bolton felt bold enough to seize Winterfell. Do you know anything else? Theon whispered, desperate. About King Robb? About the battles? The guard shrugged. I'm just a man hired for silver. I listen, that's all. He offered a faint grimace. I pity the Starks. We were told we came here to protect the seat of the king in the north from Ironborn. Now it's all changed. Best you keep your head down, Greyjoy. If the Bolton Lord decides to flay you, there's no one left to stop him. With that chilling warning, the guard stepped back. He glanced around the corridor, then marched off, leaving Theon to brood on the latest morsels of information. Something momentous must have happened in the south, perhaps a betrayal or a defeat, to embolden Bolton like this. Or maybe the letter bearing Robb's seal had been coerced. Theon could well imagine the brutal cunning it would take to corner Robb in some alliance with the Freys. Theon recalled how heavily the marriage vow to a Frey daughter weighed on Robb. He had dreaded it but known it was essential for the crossing. If the Freys had turned on him, that could only spell disaster. Anger pulsed through Theon's veins. If the Freys and Boltons were conspiring to bring down the Starks, then Winterfell was just a piece of the spoils. Theon did not doubt that Roose Bolton sought to claim the Warden of the North title, usurping House Stark's ancient right. Perhaps that was the price of some savage alliance in which the Freys got revenge for their perceived slight and the Boltons took over the North. Where did that leave Bran and Rickon? Nothing but hostages with a precarious, uncertain future. That night, or what passed for night in the dungeon, Theon pressed his ear against the stone floor. He thought he heard distant footsteps above, faint weeping, or perhaps the groan of an old door. Hallucinations, perhaps, yet he refused to slip into hopelessness. In his mind's eye, he pictured the yard where he had taught the older recruits to shoot bows, the corridors where he had chased a younger Rickon in a game of hide-and-seek, the great hall where feasts had once rung with laughter. It was all under a black pall now. Still, he clung to the memory of Robb's parted lips speaking the vow of brotherhood. They had grown up together. This could not end in darkness. Days dragged into a repetitive cycle of meager meals, restless half-sleep, and slow healing. Theon's side ceased bleeding, though it throbbed constantly. His fever receded to a dull ache behind his eyes. The cords on his wrists had frayed from the damp, but not enough for him to slip free. Each time he tested them, a guard snarled at him from beyond the bars. They left him no privacy to attempt any cunning trick. Eventually, Roose Bolton came. Theon heard the quiet footsteps before the man appeared, a measured tread that gave no hint of hurry or frustration. The cell door opened, and Bolton stood in the threshold, a single guard behind him. He held a small oil lamp, its glow revealing the hollows of Theon's face and the silver threads in Bolton's hair. Theon glowered but said nothing. "How fortunate that you've recovered," Bolton said softly, the barest hint of a smile on his pallid features. "I would have been quite displeased had your wounds turned septic. I have questions for you, Theon Greyjoy." Theon's throat felt parched, but he managed a raspy reply. "Questions you could have asked without chaining me here. Sometimes captivity clarifies the mind," Bolton said. "You were loyal to Robb Stark, a loyalty that led you to kill my bastard son and hamper my plans." He sounded neither furious nor sorrowful, more like a man reading from a ledger. "Now, we both know your father in Pike has no love for you. The rest of Westeros calls you a traitor to your own blood. So what, I wonder, do you truly desire?" Theon shifted painfully, refusing to cower under Bolton's gaze. "I desire you gone from Winterfell," he said, voice hoarse. "That's not changed." Bolton chuckled under his breath, though the sound contained no real mirth. "Straight to the point. I admire candor, though I see you still cling to illusions. Winterfell is mine, for all intents and purposes. But I could find a use for a Greyjoy if you're pliant enough. Do you not want your freedom? I want it, Theon admitted, teeth bared in something like a snarl. But not at the cost of betraying the Starks. Bolton studied him with that unsettling calm. Are you so certain you aren't already guilty of that in some measure? After all, you marched with the wolf, but still you carry the Kraken name. We're all traitors in someone's eyes. It's a question of survival. Robb Stark's cause is precarious. The Freys have parted ways with him, in a manner of speaking. Let us say the rightful king in the north no longer holds the loyalty he once did. Theon felt a spike of alarm. What have you done to him? Me? Bolton's voice remained mild. Only what was necessary for the good of the realm, you understand. War is best ended swiftly with minimal chaos. Lord Walder Frey sought vengeance for a broken marriage contract. I sought the advantage for my house. Between us, we orchestrated a certain event. The young wolf was undone, along with many of his bannermen. Now I wear the title Warden of the North, granted by the crown in King's Landing. It's all quite legitimate. A trembling horror coursed through Theon, colder than the dungeon's chill. He'd heard rumors, but hearing it confirmed by the man himself was another matter entirely. The Red Wedding, the name would come to be whispered. It all made sense. Frey treachery, Bolton's ambition. He swallowed hard, the taste of bile on his tongue. Robb Stark, the friend who had once felt more like a brother, was likely dead. If Catelyn Stark had been there, she too was lost. All those loyal men. Theon's gut twisted with grief and rage. You call it minimal chaos to kill your king at a wedding? He spat. You're filth. Bolton let out a faint sigh, as though chiding a child. He was king of nothing but a lost cause. The war in the south devoured him, and his own mistakes sealed his fate. You must learn, Theon, that illusions of honor or loyalty are trifling things. Power is what matters. Now the Lannisters are secure, King's Landing stands, and the North is under my control, nominally sworn to the Iron Throne. Disgust burned Theon's throat. He tugged at his bonds, wanting nothing more than to lunge at the man. But his arms remained pinned, and the slash in his side flared with agony at the mere movement. You're a bastard too, Bolton. No better than the one I killed. Bolton studied Theon in silence for a moment, face unreadable. Then, in a sudden shift, he turned to the guard and said, Take him to the question chamber. Gently, mind you, do not worsen his injury. I mean to see if we can hammer some sense into him. Theon's heart hammered. He knew tales of the flaying tradition in House Bolton. He realized, with a cold clarity, that Bolton was no less cruel than Ramsay, only more controlled. The sort of man who could flay someone's soul as expertly as their flesh. Still, Theon refused to show fear. He forced a sneer, even as the guard unlocked the cell and yanked him to his feet. They half-dragged him down a series of corridors to a small chamber lined with iron hooks and a sturdy table with straps. Torches in brackets threw jagged shadows on the walls. A single seat stood near the table, as though for an observer. The stench of old blood clung to the damp air. Theon's stomach lurched. This was not a place for idle conversation. Bolton followed at a measured pace, glancing at the table with dispassion. We call it the question chamber because it has a way of eliciting honest answers. He gestured for the guards to strap Theon down. Keep his arms bound, but mind that wound. I don't want him dying on me. They forced Theon onto his back, tying straps around his chest, arms, and legs. The rough hemp bit into his still tender side. He grunted, breath rasping. One guard pressed down on his shoulders while the other re-cinched the straps. Then both stepped back, letting Bolton approach. The flayed man's sigil on Bolton's breast seemed to leer at Theon in the wavering torchlight. Let us begin with simpler questions, Bolton said softly. What remains of your father's forces in the north? We know you recaptured Moat Cailin from them, but does Balon Greyjoy plan further raids? Are there ironborn captains still roaming the stony shore? Theon ground his teeth. Why would I help you? Bolton gave him a thin smile. Because I can reward cooperation with leniency. Perhaps we can come to an agreement that benefits us both. You don't want to linger in these dungeons, and I don't want to squander resources on chasing Ironborn who might be driven out more effectively with your aid. Bitterness coated Theon's words. I'd rather bite off my tongue than help you conquer more of the North. I've already done enough to drive my father's men away. Perhaps you'll feel differently in time. Bolton's voice was almost sympathetic, like a teacher instructing a stubborn student. It said you hold some affection for the Stark boys. Would you see them suffer? They remain valuable hostages, but if they become more trouble than they're worth, accidents happen. Wars are messy. Theon's heart pounded. If you harm them, the North will rise against you. Even the Lannisters won't protect you from that. Bolton's gaze flickered. The North already belongs to me, Greyjoy, and it's for me to decide what to do with the last Stark heirs. If they prove docile, I might keep them around. If not, he let the sentence dangle. Now, about the Ironborn. Theon snapped. My father never wanted me back. He didn't come for me when I was a boy. He didn't treat with Lord Stark to bring me home, and he sure as seven hells won't lift a finger to help me now. So if you're trying to use me as leverage against Balon, you're wasting your time. Bolton tilted his head, considering this. Then your father truly has no love for you. That may be useful to know, but perhaps your sister does. A memory flared of Asha's words scrawled in the margin of Balon's letter. Father rages. You're either blood or enemy. Choose wisely. Theon spat onto the floor, ignoring the fresh stab in his side. Asha fights for the Iron Islands. She won't betray my father for me. We parted ways long ago. Bolton studied Theon's eyes, as though reading the truth in them. Then he let out a quiet exhalation. If that is so, then you are less useful to me as a diplomatic token. However, you might still serve in other ways. You know the Northern Lords and their sentiments. You marched with Robb Stark. You've commanded men in this castle. Would you counsel me on how best to solidify my hold on the North? The question twisted Theon's stomach. He swallowed back a wave of revulsion. You can flay me alive, he said, voice trembling slightly. But I'll never help you. Bolton's face remained impassive. He reached out to a nearby rack of instruments. Theon's eyes flicked there, fear hammering in his chest. One tool looked like a small knife with a curved tip, glinting in the torchlight. Bolton lifted it, testing its edge against his thumb. It saddens me that you've chosen pain, he murmured. But I'll not waste more words. Theon braced himself, cold sweat trickling down his back, as the Lord of the Dreadfort stepped closer. Time stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. He waited for the blade to bite into flesh. Instead, Bolton simply traced the knife lightly along Theon's arm, enough to make the skin prickle but not break. Theon clenched his teeth, refusing to cry out. This is a slow game, Bolton said quietly. We have days, weeks, months if needed. Eventually, men talk, even stubborn men who fancy themselves loyal. I've seen it happen many times. Theon said nothing, dread thrumming through every nerve. The memory of Dagmar Cleftjaw's body on the courtyard floor, the memory of the Ironborn assault, the memory of Robb's laughter at some old jest. Everything meshed into a swirl of regret and defiance. He'd come this far. He had no illusions that his life was worth much if he broke. So he set his jaw. Bolton's calm features hardened just slightly. His free hand pressed down on Theon's wounded side, drawing a sharp hiss from Theon's lips. That's good, Bolton murmured, as though praising an animal's reaction. Pain reminds us that we're alive. It's a teacher. Let it guide you to the right choice. Hours passed in that claustrophobic chamber. Bolton alternated between quiet questioning and inflicting measured pain. Pressing, prodding, slicing shallow cuts here and there. Nothing so dire as the full art of flaying, but enough to leave Theon shaking, sweat-soaked, tears pricking his eyes. He clenched his jaw to stifle any scream, thinking only of the Stark boys and how he would not betray them, would not help this monster tighten his grip on Winterfell. He forced himself to imagine the dire wolves howling in the yard, or the hush of the gods would under moonlight. Anything to escape the slow torment that was meant to wear him down. At length, Bolton seemed to tire of the session. He dabbed a cloth at a small trickle of Theon's blood and exhaled softly. "We'll continue tomorrow. Perhaps you'll feel more cooperative after you've had time to reflect." He placed the knife back on the rack and motioned to the guards. "Take him back to his cell." They unstrapped Theon, who let out a ragged breath at the release of pressure. Then the guards dragged him upright. Each step sent jolts of agony from his various cuts. His side ached fiercely, half bound with fresh bandages that rubbed raw. He fought to remain conscious, to keep from collapsing. They hauled him down corridors to the same dank cell and flung him onto the straw pallet. The door clanged shut behind him. For a time, Theon lay there trembling, his breath hitching with each surge of pain. He was not sure which stung more, Bolton's slow, methodical cruelty or the knowledge that somewhere above these stones, Bran and Rickon were captive, at the mercy of a man who would kill them if it served his agenda. Theon had promised himself he would protect those boys. Now, strapped and bleeding in a cell, he could scarcely protect himself. He fell into a fitful sleep filled with ghosts of the dead. Robb's face, pale and blood-spattered, drifting in a watery void. Ned Stark looming in sorrowful judgment. Ramsay's sneering grin. Balon Greyjoy's cold glare. He dreamt of the sea flooding the halls of Winterfell, sweeping away hearth and home until only drowned bones remained. Theon awoke with a start, tears on his cheeks, to the sight of that same torchlit corridor and the faint trickle of water somewhere nearby. He gritted his teeth and told himself he would not break. Not today. The next session was worse, for Bolton seemed determined to push him further, employing heated irons against Theon's feet and ankles, though only briefly so as not to cripple him. Theon let out choked screams despite himself, the smell of singed flesh making his stomach churn. He prayed to the old gods, or any gods who would listen, for some deliverance. But each day bled into the next with no sign of rescue. During one such torment, Bolton paused to inform Theon, in a conversational tone, that news had arrived from Pike. Balon Greyjoy was dead, fallen from a bridge during a storm. Asha Greyjoy had apparently pressed her own claim, but a man named Euron, Balon's exiled brother, had returned to seize the sea-stone chair. Theon listened in ragged silence, barely able to form coherent thoughts. Balon, dead. The father who had never loved him. Asha, overshadowed by an uncle's ambition. Another piece of Theon's identity crumbled. Bolton gave him a thin smile. "You see, the world changes quickly. If you aligned yourself with me, you might still carve a place in it. But loyalty is your chain, yes? Loyalty to a house that is no longer anything but bones. Or do you still cling to the Starks, whose rightful lord is dead on Frylands?" Theon spat blood. "The Starks live. Bran and Rickon are the North's future, and the North will rally around them when the time is right." Bolton frowned a fraction, then pressed a hot iron near Theon's skin, just enough to make him flinch. A child who cannot walk and a boy too young to rule. Hardly an inspiring pair of leaders. No, the North will see the wisdom of a strong warden. Once certain formalities are complete, these pups won't matter. Unless, of course, they can be used to bargain with the Lannisters. He drew the iron away, leaving Theon gasping. "Reflect, Theon Greyjoy, on which side of the ledger you want to stand." With that, he signaled for the session to end. In the gloom of his cell later, Theon shuddered uncontrollably, every nerve on fire. Bolton's words tormented him almost as much as the physical pain. If the North truly had no champion left but Bran, Rickon, and a handful of loyalists scattered by war, how could they ever drive out the Boltons? Did anyone remain at Moat Cailin to rally support? Had the Great John and other Stark bannermen survived the Frey betrayal? If so, could they retake the North from a man who now had the Lannisters' backing? He closed his eyes, leaning against the cold wall. Scenes from the old days at Winterfell rose in his mind. Training with Robb, teasing Jon, hunting in the Wolfswood, bragging about archery. He might have once considered it all a dream from which he'd awoken. But it had been real, and the fierce love he'd felt for that family still burned somewhere beneath the agony. He would die before he let Roose Bolton snuff that out. Days or weeks passed in that bleak cycle. Theon found small mercies in the occasional scraps of conversation with certain guards. He learned that the northern lords were in disarray. Some had bent the knee to Bolton out of fear or practicality, while others, particularly in the west and the mountains, refused to acknowledge him. The Karstarks were in open revolt after some slight from Robb, though it was unclear if they supported Bolton or not. He heard rumors that the Manderleys of White Harbor were feigning obedience to the Iron Throne while quietly resenting the murder of the Starks. Lord Wyman was rumored to be gathering coin and building ships, though no one knew for certain if it was to appease King's Landing or for a coming rebellion. And what of the Umbers? The Glovers? Bear Island's Mormonts? The war had scattered them all, and the frigid approach of true winter made travel perilous. All the while, the White Walkers were rumored to stir beyond the wall, though the War of the Five Kings had overshadowed that threat. Whenever Theon dared to ask about the Stark boys specifically, most guards shrugged. They're above, under lock and key. Lord Bolton feeds them well enough. The younger one's got a temper, tries to fight. The older one's quiet, always watching. They have that big oaf Hodder who does their bidding. The dogs, those direwolves, are penned up in the kennels with muzzles. They're kept alive for fear of harming the precious cargo, I suppose. Precious cargo. Theon ground his teeth at that phrase. The Stark boys were living, breathing children who had lost nearly everyone they loved. He pictured Bran's haunted eyes, Rickon's trembling face. If Theon survived, he vowed he would free them somehow. That promise sustained him through the nights. One evening, Theon's cell door opened to reveal not Bolton but a group of 4 Bolton guards with drawn swords. No illusions of a friendly visit. Theon tensed, bracing for another torment session. Instead, the lead guard stooped and cut his leg bonds, then yanked him upright. "Move!" the man barked. Theon stumbled, nearly falling as blood rushed to his stiff limbs. The men half-dragged him out into the corridor. He caught glimpses of the stony walls, flickering lanterns, the swirl of cold air as they climbed a winding staircase. They emerged into a different part of the dungeons, adjacent to a lesser courtyard partially open to the sky, with a small stable entrance. Theon's head swam. Had he not seen sunlight in days or weeks? The evening light was a dusky gray, but to Theon's eyes, it felt painfully bright. He squinted, shivering in the crisp air. He was thrust into another room, somewhat larger than the prior question chamber, with a simple wooden table and chairs. Maester Luwin was there, battered but alive, arms folded inside his robes. At the far end, Theon saw Bran Stark in a wheeled chair and Rickon standing close, clutching a wooden direwolf toy. Hodder loomed protectively behind them. Bran's face was paler than Theon remembered, his once wide eyes now shadowed with caution. Rickon's hair was longer, tangled around a worried scowl. The sight of them shot a jolt of feeling through Theon's chest. Relief, guilt, sorrow, protectiveness. They were alive. Near them stood Roose Bolton, hands clasped. Several Bolton guards flanked him. The tension in the air crackled. Bolton inclined his head slightly as Theon was pushed to a kneeling position a few yards away. Theon's ankles remained unbound, but his wrists were still tied behind him, raw from rope burns. "I thought it time you saw one another," Bolton said, his tone mild, as if reuniting old friends. "The Maester has insisted upon checking the boys regularly, so I allowed him that courtesy. They are well enough." He turned to Theon. "Perhaps you'd like to reassure them of your health as well, though your appearance leaves much to be desired." Rickon took a step forward, eyes brimming with tears. "Theon," he whispered, voice trembling, "what did they do to you?" Hearing Rickon's voice, Theon had to swallow hard to keep his composure. He could imagine how he must look. Gaunt, bruised, bearing fresh cuts. "I'm all right, Rickon," he managed, though his throat felt tight. Just a few scrapes." Bolton waved a dismissive hand. "Indeed. Now, this little gathering has a purpose. Bran, Rickon, you will write to your great-uncle Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. He roams the Riverlands, rallying what remains of Robb's supporters. "We want him to know that you're alive and well, but that further resistance will bring only suffering. Tell him to lay down arms or face consequences." He might listen to the pleas of two small boys. Bran lifted his chin. "I won't tell him to surrender. He was loyal to my mother." Bolton arched an eyebrow. "A boy of principle. But you misunderstand. You're not telling him to surrender for your sake. You're telling him to do it for the realm's sake. That's how you'll phrase it. Peace is the only chance for the small folk to survive the coming winter. Appeal to his sense of honor, or love for his kin, or anything else that might sway him." Bran's lips tightened. "And if we refuse? Then Theon suffers more," Bolton said without hesitation. He turned his cool gaze on Theon. "Perhaps the big stable boy suffers. Or the dire wolves. We have many ways to punish defiance. But I would prefer compliance. Write the letter, have Maester Luwin affix his seal, and all will remain calm." Rickon's face twisted in anger. "You monster!" Bolton's expression didn't flicker. "If your father had learned to compromise, he might yet live. Let us not repeat old mistakes." Bran stared hard at Theon, tears in his eyes. Theon could almost read the guilt there. Bran blaming himself if Theon was tortured further. He gave a minuscule shake of his head, a silent plea not to yield. But Theon knew that if the boys refused, Bolton would keep his promise. Theon's nightmares would worsen. He couldn't allow them to bear that burden. He found his voice, ragged but urgent. "Bran," he said, forcing the boy's name through cracked lips. "Listen to him. Write the letter. The Blackfish. He'll read between the lines. He's no fool. He'll know what's truly happening." He nearly choked on the next words. "Better to write it than give them reason to hurt you or Rickon." Bran bowed his head. Rickon exhaled shakily. At length, Bran whispered, "All right, we'll write it, but we won't beg him to surrender. We'll only say that we're alive and that continuing the fight might harm us." Bolton gave a small, satisfied nod. "That will do. Maester Luwin can handle the wording. I only need the gist. The letter will go by Raven." Rickon glowered, tears slipping down his cheeks. "You'll never be Lord of Winterfell," he spat at Bolton. "The people will hate you." A faint smile ghosted across Bolton's lips. "Fear can be as potent as love when it comes to ruling, little Stark." He gestured to his guards. "Take the boys and the maester. Let them write. Return them to their quarters afterward. As for Theon," he looked to the men holding Theon, "bring him back below." Theon dared one last glance at Bran and Rickon as the guards manhandled him. Bran's face was ashen, Rickon near sobbing, and Hodder looked on with helpless anguish. Maester Luwin's eyes were rimmed with red. Theon couldn't speak another word before he was dragged away. He half expected to be beaten or tortured further, but the guards simply hurled him back into his cell, clanging the door shut. Theon sank onto the straw pallet, mind spinning with all he'd just witnessed. The threat to the boys was plain. Bolton intended to use them as a wedge to crack the last remnants of Stark loyalty in the Riverlands. Theon could see no easy path of escape, but he remembered how cunning the Blackfish was rumored to be. If Brynden Tully received that letter, maybe he would glean some coded message, or at least confirm that the boys lived. Maybe he'd send help. That night, Theon's mind churned. Could there be a stealth rescue? The Blackfish might not have enough men to storm Winterfell, especially if Bolton had a large garrison. But the winter nights were long and dark, and the castle had hidden passages. Even with the Boltons on high alert, there might be ways inside. If only Theon could hold out, if only the boys could survive until help came. He recalled the old tales of how the Night's Watch used hidden ways to reach the crypts when the others walked. Could those legends hold any clue? He shook his head at his own desperation. War was a more immediate threat than White Walkers. He pressed his fingers to the fresh scabs on his arms, reminding himself he was still alive. So long as he drew breath, he might shield the Stark boys in some small measure. Over the next days, Theon's routine remained the same. Occasional torment or interrogation, interspersed with bleak solitude in his cell. Bolton never directly asked Theon about the letter to the Blackfish, seemingly satisfied that the boys had complied. Instead, he pressed Theon for insights into the loyalties of various northern houses. Theon gave only half-truths or feigned ignorance, well aware that any real intelligence he provided would help Bolton tighten his hold. The man was no fool. He likely knew Theon was being evasive, but Theon gleaned enough from Bolton's pointed questions to suspect that rebellion still simmered in the north. The Manderleys, the Serwins, perhaps the Umbers. Bolton needed to quash it, and Theon's knowledge could expedite that. One frigid afternoon, while Theon was dozing in a feverish haze, a guard brought him a surprising visitor. It was the quiet youth who had once shared a trickle of news with him. The guard looked about furtively, then knelt beside Theon and offered a cup of water. "Drink," he whispered, "and hush, I can't stay long." Theon drank greedily, coughed, then asked in a rasp, "Why are you here?" The guard glanced at the corridor. "Lord Bolton is away, attending to some matter in the Great Hall. The other guards are distracted by a dispute. I wanted to warn you. Something's happening. Letters have come from the Dreadfort. Men are gathering. I think Bolton plans to move out with the bulk of the garrison, maybe to quell rebels or secure some stronghold. If that happens, he'll leave a smaller force here under a castellan's watch. It could be your chance." Theon's heart thudded. "My chance to do what? I'm half dead, chained, surrounded." "There may be ways," the guard said, voice hushed. "You helped defend Winterfell against the Ironborn. Some of the small folk remember that. If an opportunity arises, maybe they'll help. Or maybe the old crypts are still open. I don't know. Just be ready." Theon stared, hope stirring inside him. "And why warn me?" A flicker of something, shame, regret, passed over the guard's face. "I was told we'd be defending the North from outlaws, not that we'd be part of butchering the Starks. This is not what I signed on for. I can't openly defy Bolton, but I'm not blind to what's happening. At least if you escape, you might free those boys." Theon nodded, swallowing hard. "If such a chance comes, I won't forget this." He tested the ropes at his wrists. "But I can hardly reach them like this." The guard set down the water cup and, with trembling fingers, produced a small blade from his belt. He pressed it into Theon's hand with a sense of urgency. "Hide this. When they're not paying attention, you might cut those ropes. It's not much, but it's all I can do." Theon's eyes burned with sudden gratitude. He nodded, tucking the blade into the ragged hem of his tunic as best he could. "I thank you," he whispered, breath tight. "What's your name?" The guard hesitated, then said, "Call me Harith, but don't speak it aloud. Good luck to you." And with that he rose, looked around quickly, and left the cell, locking the door behind him. Theon sat there, heart pounding, a swirl of thoughts tangling in his mind. The guard's words were a lifeline in a sea of darkness. If indeed Bolton planned to ride out, leaving only a skeleton garrison, that might allow Theon some means of escape, or at least a better chance of seizing control of Winterfell from within. Yet the risk was immense. Bolton might simply strengthen the fortress with loyal men and remove the Stark boys somewhere else entirely. Or he might kill Theon outright before departing. All Theon knew was that if an opportunity arose, he had to try. He would not let Bran and Rickon vanish into the clutches of the flayed man. He had once pledged to himself that he would act as their shield, however battered that shield might be. With that vow burning in his chest, he concealed the small blade and waited. A few more days crawled by. Bolton visited less frequently, likely embroiled in his plans for departure. The sessions in the question chamber grew shorter with less violence. It was as if Roose had decided Theon's usefulness was limited, and his time was better spent managing other affairs. That left Theon alone to nurse his wounds and gather his waning strength, nibbling on stale bread, testing his bounds under the blanket of darkness. One morning, or what he presumed was morning by the thinning of gloom in the corridor, Theon heard a commotion. Hoofbeats in the yard above, men shouting commands, the clang of metal. Through the high, narrow window of his cell, he caught flickers of daylight. Theon's breath quickened. Could it be that Bolton and a large contingent were preparing to ride out? He strained his ears, picking up scraps of conversation echoing through the corridors. Lord Bolton means to quell the rebels near the White Knife. Some rumor about an uprising. Leaving a castellan, who'll keep the Stark brats in line. Ramsay's death. Our Lord says that Greyjoy filth will remain chained until he rots. The voices faded as the speakers moved away. Theon's pulse hammered. Bolton was indeed departing. The question was which men he'd leave behind, how vigilant they would be, and whether Theon could find a moment to act. If Bolton decided Theon was too dangerous, he might have him executed or maimed before leaving. Theon pressed himself against the bars, searching for a glimpse of any friendly face. None appeared. He heard the approach of footsteps, heavy with a sense of purpose. 3 men arrived in front of his cell. One was a Bolton officer with a pinched face and weary eyes. The other 2 were standard guards. The officer flicked a look at Theon. "Untie his hands," he ordered curtly. "But keep him manacled at the ankles. Lord Bolton's orders. We don't want him dying of infection before he's served any further purpose." The guards frowned but obeyed, unlocking the cell door and stepping inside with keys in hand. One stood with sword drawn while the other knelt to unlock Theon's wrist ropes. Theon's heart thudded. They were removing the ropes, but they would soon clamp irons around his ankles. This was his chance, perhaps his only chance to use the hidden blade. As the rope fell away from his wrists, Theon feigned a grunt of pain, doubling over slightly. The guard with the sword moved closer to nudge him upright. In that moment, Theon's hand darted beneath his tattered tunic, fingers closing around the small blade. The guard who was about to clasp irons on Theon's ankles looked up too late. Theon slashed at his face. The blade was small, but it carved a jagged line across the man's cheek, drawing blood and a startled cry. The guard staggered backward, dropping the manacles. Theon lunged at the guard with the sword, driving the blade into the man's side before the soldier could react fully. A clatter of steel on stone as the guard's sword fell from his grip. Theon seized it, breath hissing through clenched teeth. His body screamed in protest after so many days of torture, but adrenaline surged. The soldier collapsed, moaning, while the one with the slashed cheek scrambled back, yelling for help. The officer outside the cell sputtered in shock, drawing his own weapon. Theon drove forward, thrusting the sword through the cell's bars. He caught the officer in the shoulder or neck. Blood spurted. The man let out a wet gasp, dropping to his knees. Theon pulled the blade free, trembling with the effort. The guard with the slashed cheek tried to stand, so Theon slashed at him again, kicking the man aside. Then Theon stumbled out of the cell, nearly tripping over the dying officer. The corridor spun around him in a haze. He forced himself to breathe. No time to dwell. Reinforcements would come any moment. Theon took a single heartbeat to rummage the officer's belt, snatching a ring of keys. Then he staggered down the corridor, ignoring the fiery pain in his side, ignoring the pounding in his head. He was free, or near enough. He had to move. Hallway after hallway, Theon limped, sword in hand, scanning for a route to the upper floors. He knew Winterfell's layout by heart, but the dungeons felt different now. Guards posted in new places, some corridors blocked with fresh barricades. Shouts rang behind him. "Escape! The Greyjoy prisoner has escaped!" The noise echoed through the stone passages. Theon ducked into a side stairwell, climbing 2 steps at a time as best he could. The wound in his side throbbed relentlessly, and his shoulders ached from old burns and cuts. But the taste of freedom, of defiance, propelled him upward. He would find the Stark boys or die trying. If they were held in the Lord's Tower, he'd have to cross half the castle. The number of Bolton guards remained unknown, yet he pressed on, stepping quietly onto the next floor. The corridor here was deserted save for the hush of tapestries fluttering in a draught. Theon recognized the tapestry, a hunting scene of an old Stark lord. Through a tall window, he saw the courtyard below, filled with chaos. Men in Bolton livery mounting horses, a train of supply wagons, Roose Bolton among them, preparing to depart. Guards scurried about, and somewhere a horn blew. This was his best chance, with so many men distracted. He scanned for a path to the tower. The great keep was beyond the next courtyard, near the crumbling section of the walls. He slipped through a door into an antechamber that led to the great hall. Pausing behind the heavy door, he heard footsteps. 2 Bolton men walked past, muttering about the prisoner's escape. Theon gripped the sword hilt, heart pounding, but they didn't notice him. Once they were gone, he darted across the hall. Pillars of carved wood soared overhead, and the dais at the front stood empty of its high seat. Theon's feet skidded slightly on the cold stone. So many memories here, once filled with feasts. Now it was a hollow shell. At the far side, a door led to a corridor that climbed to the living quarters. If the boys were kept in the Lord's chambers, Theon had to go there. He bolted through. The corridor branched. To the left, steps that ascended toward the second floor. To the right, a door that led into a private audience chamber. Theon recalled seeing Bolton's men stationed near the Lord's quarters on an earlier occasion. He cursed softly. Every step threatened to reveal him to some watchful guard. But he had no choice. He chose the left, creeping up the stairs. The corridor above was lined with narrow windows, letting in the pale winter light. Theon glimpsed a pair of guards standing at the far end, near a door that likely led to the Stark children's chambers. Summoning his breath, Theon flattened himself against the wall. The corridor had nowhere to hide except behind a few pillars, but maybe he could approach quietly. Another wave of dizziness. He fought it off, gritting his teeth. 2 guards. If he was quick, he could kill or disable them before they raised an alarm. He recalled the old hunts with Robb, how they'd stalked deer. This felt like a twisted version of that skill, hunting men. He forced himself forward, step by silent step, shifting his weight on the balls of his feet. The men seemed restless, talking in low voices. Theon heard fragments of their conversation about the Lord's imminent departure. Then a floorboard creaked under Theon's foot. Both men snapped their heads up. Theon lunged, sword raised. The first guard opened his mouth to shout, but Theon's blade sliced across his throat. The second guard leapt back, fumbling for his weapon. Theon turned, breathing hard, and parried the man's clumsy slash. The clang of steel on steel rang out. The second guard was larger, but Theon's desperation lent him speed. He forced the man's sword aside and slammed the pommel into the guard's temple. The man staggered, knees buckling. Theon drove his blade through the guard's side, twisting it. Warm blood spattered across the corridor floor. Panting, Theon withdrew the sword. 2 more bodies on his conscience. He tried not to think about it. Survival was all that mattered now, his and the boys'. He shoved open the door they guarded. Inside was a small sitting room that opened into a larger bedchamber. A single brazier burned, filling the space with a mild warmth. At the far end, Theon spotted Hodder hunched in a corner, gagged and bound at the ankles. The big man's eyes went wide as he saw Theon, and he mumbled frantically against the gag. On a low table, a half-eaten meal sat, bowls of porridge. No sign of the boys. Theon hurried to Hodder, cutting his bonds with the sword. Hodder whimpered in relief, massaging his wrists. The gag fell away. "Hodder," he breathed, tears in his eyes. "Where are Bran and Rickon?" Theon asked, urgent. "Are they in the next room?" "Hodder," the big man repeated, pointing at a door. Theon pushed it open. The bedchamber inside was large, with an ornate wooden bed, a fireplace, and a broad window overlooking the courtyard. No guards inside. Bran was in his wheeled chair by the hearth, eyes huge with alarm. Rickon stood at his side, fists clenched, as if he'd been bracing for a fight he couldn't hope to win. Both boys froze at the sight of Theon's battered form, sword dripping red. But then Rickon gave a ragged sob of relief. Bran's voice came out a whisper. "Theon, how?" "No time," Theon said, glancing behind him. "We're escaping. Now, Bolton's men are distracted. Come with me." Rickon rushed forward, wanting to embrace Theon, but Theon held up a hand. "Careful," he rasped. His injuries flared with each breath. "We must move fast. Hodder's free. Can he carry you, Bran?" Bran nodded, though tears shimmered in his eyes. "Yes, yes, of course." Rickon helped Theon push the wheeled chair back into the sitting room, where Hodder stood, dazed but ready to follow Theon's lead. The big man carefully lifted Bran onto his back, securing him with strong arms. Meanwhile, Theon took a deep, unsteady breath. The corridor beyond the chamber was streaked with blood and the 2 dead guards. "We'll go out the postern gate," Theon said, forcing calm. "Fewer guards there, if any, with Bolton's men mustering in the main yard. Then we find horses. Or something." Bran's voice trembled. "The dire wolves?" Theon cursed. "Locked in the kennels, last I heard. Muzzled. We can't leave them behind, but that's across the yard. We'll try. Hurry." Hodder, Rickon, and Theon slipped from the chamber. Theon led them down the corridor, pausing to listen for approaching soldiers. The alarm might not have spread this far yet, or many men might be in the courtyard preparing to ride out. His side burned, and each footstep was a test of will. But the prospect of freeing the boys fueled him forward. They descended a cramped spiral staircase that led out near the kitchens. Servants milled about in frightened confusion, many having heard the commotion. Theon brandished his sword. "Stay out of our way," he warned. A few scattered, others cowered. The group slipped through the steamy heat of the kitchen, past the heavy doors that led out to the yard. Theon hesitated at the threshold, peeking through a small slit of a window. The courtyard was chaotic. Wagons, riders, stable boys scurrying about. Roose Bolton, astride a black horse, was barking orders to a cluster of men in his immediate retinue. Farther off, a few guards milled around the kennel area. Theon chewed his lip. That route looked guarded. "We can't cross there easily," he muttered. "Perhaps we—" A sudden shout cut him off. A soldier at the far side of the kitchen yard had spotted them. There, Greyjoys with the Stark boys. The man bellowed. Theon cursed under his breath. "Run!" he hissed, gesturing for them to bolt across the yard. If they could reach the postern gate on the western wall, they might slip out. Hodder, carrying Bran, broke into a loping stride. Rickon clung to Hodder's cloak, tears streaming. Theon raced behind them, sword in hand, ignoring the agony in his body. Bolton's men shouted. A horn blasted. Theon heard horses' hooves pounding on the packed earth. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Several riders were wheeling around, spurred by Bolton's furious commands. Theon recognized Lord Bolton himself, eyes cold with lethal intent. Crossbow bolts whistled through the air, clattering against the stone walls or skipping across the ground. Theon gritted his teeth. They had maybe 50 yards to go. The courtyard gate leading out was in sight, the wooden doors slightly ajar. If they could slip through, vanish into the outer yard or beyond the stable area, they might vanish into the wolfswood. Another bolt whipped past, nearly grazing Rickon. The boy cried out, stumbling. Theon seized Rickon's arm, hauling him upright. Hodder kept lumbering forward, panting, with Bran's arms tight around his neck. They reached the gatehouse, only to find 2 Bolton guards moving to bar their way. Theon roared in defiance and swung his sword at the first guard, who tried a clumsy parry. Their blades sparked. Theon drove forward with the last of his strength, slashing open the guard's chest. Blood spattered the gate. The other guard lunged at Theon's flank. Theon barely managed to block, wincing as his side burned. Rickon, in a surge of fear and rage, snatched up a fallen spear and jabbed it at the second guard's leg. The guard howled, losing balance. Theon capitalized with a thrust to his throat. "Through!" Theon shouted hoarsely. Hodder barreled forward, muscling the gate open. The group spilled into a narrow lane that led toward the postern door, a smaller side exit from Winterfell. Alarms sounded behind them. Theon heard Bolton's furious shout, "Stop them! No harm to the boys. Kill the Greyjoy if you must." They sprinted down the lane. The walls loomed on either side, battered from the old siege. The postern door was visible at the far end, unguarded for the moment. Theon's lungs burned, and his side threatened to give out with every step. But he wouldn't relent. They had come too far. Horses thundered behind them, soldiers on foot racing to cut them off. Just as they neared the door, a crossbow bolt slammed into Hodder's back with a dull thud. Hodder shrieked in pain, staggering forward, and Bran nearly slipped from his grasp. Theon cursed, pivoting to see a crossbowman atop the wall. Another bolt soared overhead. Rickon cried, "Hodder!" in desperation, trying to steady the big man. Hodder crashed to his knees, tears rolling down his cheeks, but with a monumental effort, he lurched upright again, the bolt sticking out of his back. "Hodder!" he moaned, voice trembling. Theon rushed to push the door open, helping Rickon drag it wide. "Hodder, can you keep going?" he demanded, heartbreak in his tone. Hodder nodded weakly, eyes brimming with agony. Hodder. He clutched Bran, who was clinging with white-knuckled fear. They staggered through the postern door and into the swirling winter air outside the castle walls. The wolfswood stretched beyond, snowy and forbidding. Theon slammed the door shut behind them, fumbling for a bar to lock it from the outside. He slid the bar into place, knowing it wouldn't hold long against a concerted effort, but it might buy them precious moments. Already, men battered the door from within. "This way," Theon rasped, pointing toward the cover of the trees. They stumbled down an icy slope, heading into the thick underbrush. Adrenaline spurred them on. Theon heard shouts, the clang of weapons on the barred door. They had seconds before the Boltons spilled out in force, or circled around another exit to cut them off. Theon pressed forward, though every step jarred his side. Deeper into the wolfswood they fled, branches lashing at them, snow crunching underfoot. Rickon panted, eyes wide, glancing back every few steps. Hodder plowed onward, though blood seeped through his tunic around the crossbow bolt. Bran clung to him, tears streaking his cheeks. Theon prayed the big man's strength wouldn't fail. At last, they reached a clearing surrounded by ancient pines. Theon paused, chest heaving, to look back. He saw no immediate sign of pursuit, but that wouldn't last. Bolton's riders would soon scour the area. Hodder sank to his knees, gently setting Bran down in the snow. The big man panted, sweat and tears mingling on his face. Bran's voice trembled with concern. "Theon, we need to get this bolt out of him or he'll bleed more or get sick." Theon knelt, wincing at his own wounds. He examined the crossbow bolt in Hodder's back. It had lodged just beneath the shoulder blade, not deep enough to puncture a lung, hopefully, but it was embedded firmly. "Hodder," Theon said, voice thick. "This is going to hurt like the stranger's lash, but if we leave it, you'll die. We need to pull it out, then bandage you." Hodder whimpered, tears in his eyes, but nodded. Hodder. He clenched his jaw, or tried to, as Theon braced a hand against his back, gripping the bolt. Rickon stood by, looking petrified. Bran watched with horror. Theon counted softly, 1, 2, 3, and yanked the bolt free. Hodder let out a howling moan, thrashing. Blood spurted, and Theon pressed his hand to the wound, cursing that they had no proper bandages. He tore strips from his ragged tunic, pressing them tight. Hodder gasped, tears spilling, but gradually his breathing steadied to trembling sobs. "There," Theon murmured. "Best we can do for now. We have to keep moving." He looked at the boys, voice urgent. "Bolton's men will come. They'll have dogs, maybe. We must go deeper into the forest." Bran swallowed, looking around. "We know some paths from the old days. Robb and I followed Father hunting once, near the Lich Yard. Maybe we can find that old track that leads to the holdfast by the White Knife." He trailed off, glancing at Theon uncertainly. Theon nodded. "Lead the way. We'll do our best to hide our tracks." Hodder, grimacing in pain, lifted Bran again. Rickon clung to Theon's side. Together, they limped away from the clearing, forging deeper into the wolfswood. Snow fell softly, blanketing the pine boughs and muffling their footsteps. The wind carried distant echoes, horns, shouts, the bark of dogs. Bolton's men were on the hunt. Hour after hour, they pressed on, wading through drifts of snow, ducking beneath low branches. Their clothing was thin for the winter chill, and Theon's body threatened to betray him at every turn, raw from torture. Hodder's wound bled through makeshift bandages, but the big man still trudged, half in a daze, guided by Theon's occasional push and Bran's quiet instructions. Rickon whimpered with cold but refused to complain, doggedly pressing forward. They paused at a narrow stream, partially iced over, to drink and wash some of the blood from Hodder's wound. Bran's teeth chattered uncontrollably. Rickon was pale, his breath shuddering. Theon wanted desperately to light a fire, but that would draw searchers like a beacon. So they huddled in the lee of a rocky outcrop, the wind keening above, until night draped the forest in darkness. Hodder slumped, exhausted, and Theon let him rest. He himself was on the brink of collapse, his side throbbing with each heartbeat. But fear for the boys drove him to remain alert, sword at the ready. If Bolton's men found them, Theon would sell his life to buy Bran and Rickon a chance to flee. Yet as the hours crept on, no search party appeared, perhaps stymied by the terrain or the onset of night. Eventually, Theon drifted into a light, tormented doze, propped against the rock. His dreams were a jumbled swirl of memories. Ned Stark's solemn face, Robb's laughter, the bitter tang of the Iron Islands sea spray. When he blinked awake, the sky was a faint gray, heralding dawn. Snow had fallen in the night, dusting them with a white layer. Theon shook himself, wincing at how stiff his limbs felt. Next to him, Rickon was curled up, while Hodder dozed in a sitting position, Bran still on his lap. Theon frowned at the blood on the bandages. They needed better care or Hodder would not last. Bran stirred. "Theon?" he whispered, voice raw with cold. Theon answered softly. "We should go. We can't stay here." Bran swallowed. "We need a destination, a place that might shelter us. I know White Harbor is too far, and the old holdfast by the White Knife. It might be rumored in stories, but I don't know if we'll find it in time." Theon thought a moment, teeth chattering. "We could try heading northwest, toward the Bar Rollins, or find the Umbers near Last Hearth. If any remain loyal to House Stark, they might shelter you." Bran's eyes glistened. "We might starve or freeze before we get there. We have no supplies, but we can try. Our only chance is if we can travel unnoticed, or if the loyal bannermen hide us." A branch snapped in the distance. Theon froze, hand gripping his sword. Another snap, then a low growl that echoed among the trees. The group tensed. Could it be direwolves? They had no idea where Summer or Shaggy Dog were kept. This sounded different, more feral, as if from a wild beast. Theon motioned for silence, heart thudding. A shape emerged from the gloom. A wolf, lean with hunger, fur bristling, eyes reflecting the early dawn light. Another appeared at its flank. A small pack, perhaps drawn by the scent of blood. Rickon let out a stifled cry. Hodder moaned softly. Theon stood, brandishing his sword to keep them at bay. The largest wolf snarled, fangs bared. Theon shouted, stamping forward. They might be able to scare them off if the wolves were wary of armed men. But the animals were hungry. They circled warily, one edging closer to Hodder and Bran. In that instant, a gust of wind carried new scents, and the wolves hesitated, whining softly. Theon heard a whistle from behind him. Startled, he spun, sword raised. A trio of cloaked figures emerged from between the pines, bows in hand. One was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing furs that looked thick enough to keep out the worst winter. Another was slighter, face obscured by a hood. The third carried a long spear. The wolves retreated, apparently unnerved by these new arrivals. "7 save us?" Theon muttered, uncertain if these were friends or foes. He tensed for a fight. One figure pulled back their hood, revealing a woman with gray-streaked hair, a stern face, and piercing eyes. She wore a patch of cloth depicting a white sun, a manderly crest, perhaps, though it looked improvised. She spoke in a firm voice, "Drop your sword, stranger. We mean no harm, but if you threaten us, you'll regret it." Theon's heart leapt. If they were Manderly men and women, there might be hope, but he had to tread carefully. He forced a hoarse reply, "We have no quarrel with you. We're fleeing the Boltons. We carry the Stark heirs." At that, the woman's eyes flicked to Bran and Rickon. Her expression shifted from suspicion to shock. The other two figures tensed, exchanging glances. She lifted her spear slightly. "Stark heirs? By the gods." The rumors said the younger Starks were captive at Winterfell or dead. "Step forward. Let me see." Cautious, Theon lowered his sword but did not completely drop it. He moved aside so they could see Bran in Hodder's arms and Rickon standing near, a frightened boy with disheveled hair. The woman inhaled sharply. "It's them," she murmured. "The living, spitting image of the Lord Stark's family." She looked back at Theon. "But who are you?" Rickon blurted. "This is Theon Greyjoy. He saved us from the Boltons. He was Robb's friend." Theon cringed slightly, well aware that many in the north might hate him for his surname alone. But the woman studied him thoughtfully. "Greyjoy, is it? The war turned half the realm upside down. I remember hearing Theon Greyjoy was a ward to Eddard Stark. If you truly saved the boys from the flayed man, you have my respect, if not my full trust." She glanced at her companions. "We can't linger. The Boltons will be after them. By the old gods, we cannot let them be captured again." She nodded at the men. "We're a scouting party for House Manderly, come north to assess the Bolton threat. We heard rumors that the Stark boys might still live. Didn't expect to find them in the middle of the Wolfswood. The gods must be with us." Theon felt weak with relief. "Can you help us reach safety?" he asked, voice tight with exhaustion. "We have wounded. Hodder, he's been shot. We have little food or supplies." The woman motioned for them to lower their bows. "I will bind your friend's wound. You'll come with us to our camp. A day's ride from here. We have healers. Then we'll decide how to proceed. Lord Wyman Manderly might want to see these boys. He's none too fond of Bolton rule, that's for certain." She approached Hodder gently, checking the wound in his back. "The bolt is out at least. He's lost blood, but we have salves. You," she added, glancing at Theon's battered frame, "are also in need of care." Theon nodded, tears threatening to spill from exhaustion and overwhelming relief. Bran, still on Hodder's back, let out a shuddering breath, and Rickon grabbed Theon's sleeve, eyes full of gratitude. They had escaped. They weren't safe yet, but they had found help. A small band from a house that still honored the Stark name. Perhaps hope remained for the north after all. The woman signaled her companions. "Come, we'll circle wide around Winterfell to avoid Bolton patrols. It's a harsh trek, but better than your alternative." She offered a tight smile to Bran and Rickon. "You'll be all right now, little lords. You're among friends." Slowly, they moved deeper into the forest, shielded by the tall evergreens. The wolves that had threatened them earlier slunk away, overshadowed by the presence of armed humans. The day brightened into a cold, leaden sky. Snow fell in soft flurries, dusting their footprints. The Manderly scouts guided them through winding paths, often stopping to check for signs of pursuit. Theon stumbled, leaning on Rickon for support when his side flared. Twice they paused to rest, letting Hodder catch his breath, letting the scouts share water and dried meat. They told Theon that House Manderly was quietly gathering allies, waiting for the right moment to defy Roose Bolton openly. The name White Harbor gleamed like a distant beacon of sanctuary. Though the way was perilous, every step took them further from Bolton's swords and the suffocating darkness of that dungeon. Theon inhaled the crisp forest air, almost disbelieving that he was free. He had no illusions that his future would be easy. The entire north was under occupation by a traitorous warden, and winter was upon them. But he had kept the boys safe, at least for now. The vow he made in the crypts, the vow to protect Bran and Rickon, had not been broken. In the swirl of events still unfolding, that might be enough to keep hope alive. They traveled until dusk, settling into a makeshift camp behind a ridge where the wind was blocked. There, the Manderley scouts built a small, smokeless fire, enough warmth to spare Hodder from further shock. Bran and Rickon huddled near it, sipping hot broth one of the scouts brewed. Theon sat, back against a rock, letting the woman, her name, he learned, was Narya Manderley, a distant cousin to Lord Wyman, clean his injuries with a pungent salve. He grimaced at the sting, but murmured gratitude. She nodded with a respect that transcended old grudges. Later, Rickon dozed off, exhausted. Bran tried to keep watch, but his eyelids drooped. Hodder slept fitfully, a bandage tight around his shoulder. Theon remained awake, sword across his lap, eyes scanning the dark trees. He thought of Moat Cailin, the men he had left behind, uncertain of their fate under the Boltons. He wondered if they had fought or bent the knee. He pictured Lady Hornwood, the Blackfish, all the scattered survivors of Robb's downfall. The realm was shattered, full of betrayal, but the Stark name still had power in the hearts of many. Seeing Bran and Rickon safe, if only temporarily, gave Theon a sense of grim purpose. If House Manderley and other loyalists united, perhaps they could free the North from the flayed man's grip. At one point in the night, Narya Manderley approached and crouched beside Theon. She regarded him steadily. "You're a Greyjoy," she said, not quite a question. "I am," Theon agreed softly. She hesitated. "You fought your own father's men for Winterfell. You saved these Stark heirs from the Boltons. That's not what I would have expected from any Ironborn." Theon stared into the dying embers of the fire. "They were my family too, in a way. Ned Stark raised me, gave me a home. I couldn't stand by and let them be destroyed." Narya studied his face, reading the scars of torment. "Many in the North will still doubt you. They'll remember your father's rebellion, your surname. But what you've done for these boys may earn some measure of forgiveness." Theon exhaled, sorrow lacing his tone. "I'm not seeking forgiveness. I'm just trying to do what's right. It's all I have left." She nodded, as if satisfied with the answer. "Rest if you can," she said, rising. "We have miles to go tomorrow." So Theon dozed, chin dropping against his chest. In his dreams, he saw a younger Robb Stark clasping him on the shoulder, both of them grinning after a hunt. He saw Ned Stark's face, neither condemning nor absolving. He saw Balon, swirling into the sea. He saw the crypts where he had knelt in chains, and a voice whispered, "The North remembers." When he awoke, the gray light of dawn filtered through the pines. No horns shattered the silence. No men in flayed man's sigils swarmed them. For now, at least, they were safe. They broke camp quickly, pressing onward with the scouts. Narya told them of a hidden path through a low ridge that would bring them to a network of old logging trails, from which they could angle southeast toward White Harbor or choose a different route if needed. Theon dreaded the distance. White Harbor was leagues away, across rough winter terrain. Hodder, though bandaged, stumbled in pain every few hours, requiring frequent stops. Theon's own battered body threatened collapse, but the impetus to protect Bran and Rickon fueled them all. The boys leaned on the grown-ups for support, physically and emotionally. Throughout their journey, the scouts kept an eye on the sky, worried about roving Bolton patrols that might watch from vantage points or, worse, use ravens to track them. But fortune, or the old gods, favored them. They encountered only a handful of small folk huts, none of whom recognized or opposed them. At night, they took shelter in abandoned crofters' cottages, nibbling dried fish from the Manderley packs. Each step away from Winterfell eased Theon's nightmares slightly, though he remained vigilant, haunted by the memory of Roose Bolton's calm cruelty. The cold grew fiercer as they traveled. Sometimes the wind cut like knives through their cloaks. Snowstorms blew in unexpectedly, forcing them to hunker down and wait out the worst. Theon worried that the boys, especially Rickon, might succumb to illness. But Narya shared what little she had, tonics and herbs. Bran coughed at night, though he insisted he was fine. After nearly a fortnight of slow progress, the group approached a crossroads near a partially frozen river. A thick stand of pines blocked the wind, and the scouts decided to rest. Bran stared at the half-iced water, remembering how he'd once dreamt of wolves roaming the banks. Theon walked among the trees, trying to stretch his healing limbs. His side still twinged with each breath, but the cut had closed enough that he no longer bled. At midday, they heard the distant clatter of hooves. The scouts scrambled, urging everyone to hide among the pines. Anxiety knotted Theon's gut. Had Bolton's men tracked them? They crouched behind thick trunks, weapons at the ready. The sound drew closer. A party of 5 riders from the west, wearing cloaks dusted with snow. As they came into view, Theon noticed the sigil on one rider's surcoat. A white sun on a blue field, the Manderley standard in full. Another wore the triple spiral of House Serwyn. Allies? Narya hailed them quietly, stepping out of the trees. The riders reined in, startled, before one recognized her. Narya? By the gods! What are you doing out here? Narya motioned for Theon and the others to emerge. We found them, she said, voice brimming with emotion. Bran and Rickon Stark, alive, fled from Winterfell under Bolton's nose, thanks to Theon Greyjoy. A gasp went through the riders. One of them, an older man with a bushy gray beard, dismounted hastily. He approached the boys, dropping to a knee. My lords, he breathed, tears glistening in his eyes. You live. The North has hope yet. Bran swallowed, nodding shyly, while Rickon clutched Theon's sleeve. The older man regarded Theon with curiosity. So you're the Greyjoy who saved them? We owe you a debt. Theon dipped his head in quiet acknowledgement. It was the least I could do. One of the riders stepped forward, a lean figure with sharp eyes. We bring word from White Harbor. Lord Wyman is rallying. He's made overtures to certain northern houses that remain loyal to the Stark line. The Boltons try to secure their hold, but the Manderleys have grown bold, especially with a rumor that the boys might be alive. This proves it. His gaze moved to Bran's wasted legs, Rickon's gaunt features, and Hodder's bonda. Get form. We must get them to safety. White Harbor, or perhaps a hidden stronghold where they can be fostered quietly until the time is ripe. Another rider interjected. If the Boltons learn the Stark heirs are truly among the Manderleys, they'll march on White Harbor with all the force they can muster. That could spark a new war. Are we ready for that? Narya squared her shoulders. Better a new war than living under flayed banners. The North remembers. With these boys, we can rally the scattered loyalists. Lord Wyman has ships, gold, and cunning. The Lannisters will be busy with other matters. Word is King's Landing faces unrest. This is our moment. The old man nodded gravely. We'll take them to a safe location quietly, then let the Boltons try to find them in a maze of loyal houses. Meanwhile, the Manderleys gather enough strength to strike. If we coordinate with other lords, maybe the Umbers, the Glovers, the Reeds, we can squeeze the Boltons from multiple sides. Relief and anxiety swirled in Theon's gut. He had feared that with Robb dead and so many bannermen lost, the North would surrender to Roose Bolton. But here was a glimmer of defiance, a plan forming. The Starks, Bran and Rickon, remained symbols of the old line, rallying hearts. Theon realized this might be the best chance to free Winterfell entirely. Yet it also painted a target on the boys' backs, for Bolton would stop at nothing to snuff out that spark. The riders offered Bran and Rickon their horses, eager to relieve Hodder's burden. The big man groaned as they carefully helped him onto a mount of his own, ignoring his protests of Hodder, Hodder. The scouts and riders debated their route. Finally, they agreed to take a winding path east, away from the main roads to avoid detection. From there, they'd slip south into friendlier territory under Manderley watch. Before they set off, the old man offered Theon a waterskin. You're wounded. Let me see. He peeled back Theon's cloak, examining the half-healed slash. Not good, but you've survived worse, it seems. If you'll permit it, we have a better healer in our party. A middle-aged woman with a satchel of herbs approached. She cleaned the scabbed cut, applied a poultice that stung fiercely, then bound it with cleaner bandages. You'll carry that scar, but it won't kill you now, she said kindly. We owe you, after all. Without you, these boys might be rotting in Bolton's dungeons." Theon swallowed, feeling a prickle behind his eyes. He had grown so used to torment and distrust that kindness felt foreign. "Thank you," he muttered hoarsely. They mounted up, Theon sharing a horse with one of the scouts since he was too weak to ride alone. Hodder, though pained, held onto the saddle. Bran rode with the old man, while Rickon rode behind the woman who'd just treated Theon. The battered company set forth, forging a trail through the snow-laden woods. In the days that followed, Theon witnessed the slow blossoming of hope. Each time they stopped at a hidden camp or an out-of-the-way settlement, they found pockets of small folk or lesser knights who recognized the Stark name with tears of joy. Offers of provisions, fresh bandages, and hidden shelter were made. No one openly proclaimed war against Bolton, for his reach was still formidable, but Theon could feel the undercurrent of rebellion stirring. White Harbor was not so far now, and the Manderleys had a plan to bring the boys in discreetly. Once there, a safer arrangement could be made, possibly sending Bran and Rickon to a remote stronghold. They had no illusions that the road ahead would be simple. The Boltons still held Winterfell. The Lannisters controlled the Iron Throne. The snows were deepening, and true winter was clawing at the land. But at least they were not alone in the wilderness, battered and hopeless. Here, in the quiet hearts of the North, men and women still remembered Eddard Stark, still yearned to avenge the Red Wedding, still believed in the resilience of House Stark. For Theon, each new league they traveled felt like a step farther from the dungeon walls that had nearly broken him. The pangs of guilt for his family name still gnawed at him, but with every moment he spent aiding the boys, he felt a measure of atonement. He had chosen to be a Greyjoy no longer in spirit, but rather a man shaped by the North, by Ned Stark's example, by Robb's friendship. It gave him a fragile sense of belonging. One evening, as they neared the outskirts of Manderley-held territory, they made camp in the ruins of an old watchtower set on a rise. The watchtower had partially collapsed, but enough remained to shelter them from the wind. Theon, leaning on a stone, stared out at the icy expanse below. Moonlight glistened off the snow, turning the landscape into a ghostly sea. Bran joined him, perched on a makeshift seat fashioned from rubble. His legs, though useless, no longer seemed to weigh as heavily on his spirit. He looked at Theon, eyes thoughtful. "We've come so far," he said quietly, "and it still doesn't feel real. Sometimes I think I'll wake up and be back in Winterfell's crypts." Theon nodded, gazing into the distance. "I know. It haunts me too." Bran touched the stone with gloved fingers. "Do you think we'll ever be truly safe again? That we'll ever return home?" Theon let out a slow breath. "I don't know, Bran. I hope so. This war, the Boltons, they've taken so much. But the North is vast, and winter is long. We might find a way." He paused, searching for words. "You're the rightful Lord of Winterfell, even if you're young. Men will follow you. They're just scattered. House Manderley is strong. Others will come if they believe they have a chance." Bran looked down, a flicker of doubt in his face. "I don't feel like a lord. I just feel tired, scared for Rickon, missing everyone. Father, mother, Robb." A tear slipped down his cheek, but he set his jaw. "But I won't let them win. I won't let House Bolton destroy what's left of us." Theon reached out, placing a tentative hand on Bran's shoulder. "We won't let them," he said softly, surprising himself with the resolve in his tone. They lapsed into silence, the wind softly moaning through the watchtower's broken stone. Below them, the campfires glowed as the Manderley riders and scouts prepared for another cold night. Rickon slept nearby, curled in Hodder's arms for warmth, while Narya Manderley stood watch on the perimeter, bow slung across her back. The night sky sparkled with distant stars. Theon thought of the old gods, the weirwood trees, and the faint promise that somehow the realm might mend after all this bloodshed. He did not know what the morrow would bring. Perhaps a deeper war, perhaps a journey to the coast, perhaps letters to the scattered lords. But for the first time since the dungeon, he felt a fragile sense of purpose. He was free of the Boltons' torment, and the Stark boys were alive. That, at least, was victory enough to carry him forward. The next morning, they continued east, eventually crossing the White Knife under the guidance of Manderly scouts who knew the hidden fords. The weather turned brutal, whipping snow into swirling drifts. They pressed on, half-blinded, often forced to stop early to avoid losing the horses. Hodder bore his pain silently, and Theon's side burned whenever the cold sank deep. But the group found small barns, remote holdfasts, or seldom-used hunting cabins to shelter in, aided by local peasants who recognized the Manderly crest. It was in one such cabin that they finally met a Manderly outrider who arrived with an urgent message. Nerya summoned Theon, Bran, Rickon, and the rest to gather by the small hearth. The outrider, covered in snow, shook out his cloak and delivered his tidings in a hushed but excited tone. "Lord Wyman is ready for you. He's secured part of the Wolf's Den in White Harbor, away from prying eyes. He plans to hide the boys there under heavy guard, while negotiations with certain other houses commence. Then, when the time is right, he'll present them publicly to rally the North." Bran, perched on a chair with Rickon at his side, exchanged a hopeful glance with Theon. The outrider continued, "We must reach White Harbor soon, but we must do so secretly. Lord Wyman insists we use the Lesser Gate by night to avoid any Lannister or Bolton spies." Nerya nodded. "We'll be cautious. The Boltons mustn't suspect the boys are here." Rickon frowned. "Will we ever fight them? Or do we just hide while they rule from Winterfell?" The outrider smiled kindly. "We fight when we can win, young lord. Not before." That evening, they set out for White Harbor in the midst of a snow-laden twilight. The journey took another full day, but at last the coastal winds carried a tang of salt, and Theon glimpsed the distant outline of the city's walls. White Harbor was the North's sole true city, hugging the mouth of the White Knife, with strong granite fortifications and a harbor that could berth large ships. Lights flickered along the battlements. Theon recalled visiting once long ago with Robb, marveling at the bustling docks and the imposing Wolf's Den, a fortress that had served as a prison in older times. They bypassed the main gates, following a narrow track that skirted the walls. Night had fallen fully by the time they reached a smaller sally port. After a soft exchange of passwords, guards loyal to Lord Wyman ushered them inside with hushed urgency. They led the group through back streets and alleys, away from the main thoroughfares, to an old section of the city overshadowed by looming walls. The Wolf's Den rose like a gray sentinel, its towers partially restored. Manderly men stood watch, stern-faced in the gloom. Inside, torchlight revealed a newly fortified courtyard. The group dismounted, stiff with cold and fatigue. Stable hands whisked the horses away. Then an aide approached, bowing low. "My lords, Lady Nerya, good sirs, Lord Wyman awaits." They were guided through a series of corridors to a large chamber warmed by a blazing hearth. There, seated on a cushioned chair, was Lord Wyman Manderly himself, a large man with a broad girth, white hair, and a heavy beard. He hauled himself to his feet with a grunt of effort, face alight with relief and emotion as he saw Bran and Rickon. "By the gods," he breathed, waddling forward. "They live. The little wolves live. My dear friends, welcome. This is an answered prayer." He swept both boys into a gentle embrace, tears shining in his eyes. Hodder loomed uncertainly, letting Bran be lifted from his arms. Rickon clung to the Lord's cloak, half in tears from exhaustion. Nerya stepped forward, explaining how Theon had rescued them from Winterfell. Lord Wyman regarded Theon with a complex expression. "You're the one who parted ways with Balon Greyjoy? You are the same man who helped my young king wage war, then saved these boys from the Ironborn, and now from Bolton's clutches." Theon bowed his head, uncertain what to say. "I did what was necessary," he managed quietly. Lord Wyman's voice wavered with emotion. "For that you have my gratitude, Theon Greyjoy. The North does not forget those who save Stark lives. You are hurt, I can see. Let our healers tend you. Then we'll talk of what comes next." He clapped his hands. Servants rushed forward with blankets, steaming bowls of stew, pitchers of hot wine. Theon felt light-headed at the kindness. After so much suffering, Bran and Rickon were led to chairs near the hearth, where they devoured warm bread. Hodder was guided to a bench where healers examined his wounded shoulder. Theon sank onto a stool, letting a servant take his sword for a moment. He shuddered as the warmth enveloped him, half afraid it was all a dream. Lord Wyman fussed over the boys. "I'll keep you safe here," he promised, voice thick. "The Boltons might suspect something, but they dare not openly assault White Harbor yet. We remain a vital link for trade. They need my cooperation. So long as we keep your presence secret, we can gather allies. When the time is right, we'll show the North that the Starks endure." Bran, weary but determined, nodded. "Thank you, Lord Wyman," he said softly. We have to free Winterfell someday. It belongs to us." Wyman's face hardened. "That day will come, my lord. We must be patient and cunning. Roose Bolton may wear the title Warden, but the North will not bow to him forever." Narya approached Theon, pressing a mug of hot wine into his hands. "Drink," she said gently. "You've earned it." Theon nodded, swallowing a mouthful that seared his throat. He felt the tension of the last fortnight slowly unravel, replaced by exhaustion so profound he could scarcely keep upright. "What will you do with me, my lord?" he asked, voice trembling slightly. "I know many in the North might not trust a Greyjoy." Wyman studied him. "You saved Bran and Rickon, defied the Boltons, and bled for it. My intention is to grant you the courtesy of a guest, not a prisoner. If you wish to stay here, you may. If you have other intentions, we can discuss them. But I suspect you might want to see this through. You have the look of a man seeking redemption. Am I wrong?" Theon's chest constricted. "No, you're not wrong." "Then remain at White Harbor under my protection," Wyman offered, "and help us plan the liberation of the North. We will not forget your deeds today." Tears brimmed in Theon's eyes, unbidden. He bowed his head, shoulders trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, thinking of Ned Stark, of Robb, of all he had lost. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the hearth and the murmured sounds of the busy hall envelop him. Bran's quiet voice, Rickon's tired thanks, Hodder's relieved Hodder. The clank of bowls being set out. For the first time in many moons, Theon dared to believe that tomorrow could hold something more than pain and fear. So it was that Theon Greyjoy found himself in White Harbor, alive but scarred, allied with House Manderly in secret. The Stark boys had a measure of safety at last, hidden behind loyal walls. Outside those walls, the war churned on, with the Boltons' treachery and the Lannisters' power overshadowing the realm. But in the hush of the wolf's den, a seed of resistance took root. The boys of Winterfell, Bran and Rickon, breathed free air, guarded by a man once called a hostage, an Ironborn who had chosen loyalty to the North. Across the miles of frozen forest and stormy seas, threats loomed, yet hope simmered in the hearts of those who would see the flayed banners fall. And in that fragile hope lay the promise that winter's darkness, however fierce, would not endure forever. The stark words echoed softly in Theon's mind. Winter is coming, but so too might spring, when the snows receded and the rightful heirs of the North could reclaim their seat. Until that day, Theon swore he would stand guard, sword in hand, redeeming himself one step at a time. In a world stained by betrayal, he had chosen to protect what family he had left, and that choice would guide him through whatever trials lay ahead.